The Montana wilderness had been Mason Thorne's sanctuary and prison for 6 long years. The towering pines standing sentinel around his isolated cabin, the rugged mountains cutting him off from the world of men, they suited a man who no longer belonged anywhere else. December 1879 brought the worst blizzard in living memory to Blackfoot Valley. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, transforming the landscape into something alien and hostile. Mason had seen 42 winters, 15 of them in these mountains, but nothing like this storm. He moved through the swirling white darkness with practiced stealth rifle slung across his back, eyes narrowed against the biting wind. The deer tracks he'd been following had disappeared beneath fresh powder, but Mason wasn't ready to return to his empty cabin. The silence there pressed in on him more heavily than the storm. The wind shifted suddenly, carrying something that made him freeze mid-stride. A sound faint but unmistakable. A human cry. Mason turned his head, trying to locate the source. It came again, weaker this time, nearly swallowed by the howling wind. Someone was out in this killing weather. He abandoned the hunt immediately, moving toward the sound with new urgency. The snowfall thickened, reducing visibility to mere feet. Mason navigated by instinct, his body remembering the terrain his eyes could no longer see. The cry came once more, then fell silent. Mason quickened his pace, pushing through drifts that reached his thighs. His breath crystallized before him, each inhalation painful in the frigid air. He almost missed it, a dark shape beneath the white, half buried in a snowbank. The stagecoach had overturned its wooden frame, splintered against the rocks. One wheel still spun lazily in the wind, a grotesque reminder of momentum violently arrested. Mason approached cautiously, rifle ready. 6 years of solitude had taught him wariness. The horses lay dead in their traces, already becoming mounds of white. The driver hung from his seat at an unnatural angle, his skin blue-white with death. "Hello," Mason called, his voice rough from disuse. Only the wind answered. He circled the wreckage, stepping carefully over a body in city clothes, a passenger thrown clear. Another corpse lay half-buried nearby, a man in a guard's rough attire. Mason had seen enough death to recognize its finality without touching either man. A soft sound barely audible drew him to a drift piled against a large boulder. Something dark showed through the snow-expensive fabric. Mason began digging with gloved hands, setting his rifle carefully within reach. A woman's traveling cloak emerged, first fine wool lined with fur, then a gloved hand so small it might have belonged to a child. Working faster now, driven by urgency, he didn't want to examine Mason, uncovered the rest of her. She lay curled like a question mark, arms wrapped around herself, face half hidden, beneath hair the color of chestnuts. Her traveling dress, though torn and soaked, spoke of money blue wool with ivory buttons, delicate lace at collar and cuffs. City clothes as impractical as a paper parasol in a thunderstorm. Mason pressed 2 fingers to her throat, expecting nothing. Her skin felt like marble, cold and smooth. Then impossibly, a flutter against his fingertips, a pulse barely there, fighting against inevitability. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing a glimpse of startling green. She looked at him without seeing, pupils dilated with cold and shock. "Stay with me," Mason said, the words foreign after so much silence. He lifted her from the snow, cradling her against his chest. She weighed nothing, a bundle of sodden fabric and frozen flesh. Her head lolled against his shoulder, revealing a gash along her hairline. Blood had frozen in rusty streaks down her temple. The wound needed immediate attention. Memories of battlefield medicine flooded back, unwelcome but necessary. Mason calculated rapidly. The cabin was 20 minutes in good weather, perhaps 40 in this storm. Too long. He found shelter beneath an outcropping of rock where the snow hadn't penetrated. Setting the woman down as gently as possible, Mason shrugged off his pack and extracted what he needed with practiced efficiency. Whiskey, clean cloth needle, and catgut suture he always carried from old habit. The woman moaned softly as he cleaned the wound. Good pain meant life. The gash was deep but clean, a simple laceration that would heal well if infection could be prevented. Mason worked swiftly, fingers remembering skills he had tried to forget. "Forgive me," he murmured as he pushed the needle through her skin. She didn't cry out, which concerned him, too far gone into cold and shock to feel pain properly. 7 neat stitches closed the wound. Mason wrapped her in his spare blanket, then lifted her again. The storm had intensified, visibility now down to arm's length. He oriented himself by the slope of the ground and began the long journey home. The cabin materialized from the white void like a mirage, its solid log walls and smoking chimney, a beacon of impossible warmth. Mason had left the fire bank that morning, a habit of practicality rather than hope for his own survival. He shouldered open the door, careful not to jostle his burden. The interior was dim but warm, the single room dominated by a stone fireplace where embers still glowed. Mason laid the woman on his bed, a simple frame with a straw mattress pushed against the far wall. He built up the fire with practiced movements, adding logs until flames leapt high. The cabin filled with light and crackling heat. Only then did Mason return to the woman, assessing her with clinical detachment. She would die in those wet clothes. The knowledge was uncomfortable but certain. Mason had been a doctor too long to hesitate over proprieties when life hung in the balance. Still, his hands shook slightly as he unbuttoned the blue dress. Beneath lay layers of feminine mystery corset chemise petticoats, each soaked through. Mason worked methodically, removing the sodden garments until she lay in only her shift. Even that clung to her body in ways that made him turn his face away. He wrapped her in his heaviest buffalo robe, tucking it around her like a child. Her clothes he hung on pegs and chairbacks, transforming the cabin into a lady's dressing room. The expensive fabric steamed in the heat, filling the air with the scent of wet wool and something else, perfume, he realized. Lavender and rose. Ghost scents from another world. The woman hadn't stirred since that brief moment of consciousness in the snow. Her face had lost its marble pallor, showing faint pink in the firelight, but her eyes remained closed. Dark lashes fanned against cheeks that had probably never seen sun without a parasol's protection. Mason heated water, preparing the herbs he would need: yarrow for fever, willow bark for pain. The movements were automatic, hands remembering what his mind wished to forget. He had sworn never to practice medicine again. Yet here he was, falling into old patterns as if the intervening years had never been. He lifted the woman's head, gently supporting her neck as he coaxed warm liquid between her lips. She swallowed reflexively, another good sign. Mason continued with small sips until half the mixture was gone. The remainder of the evening passed in vigil. Mason sat beside the fire, watching the rise and fall of the woman's chest beneath the buffalo robe, counting breaths like a man might count prayers if he still believed in such things. Outside, the storm raged with unprecedented fury, as if all the demons of winter had converged on Blackfoot Valley. The cabin creaked and groaned but held firm, its thick walls and tight construction a testament to Mason's skill. He had built this place as a fortress against memory. Now it had become sanctuary for a stranger. Near midnight, the woman stirred. A soft moan escaped her lips, the first sound she'd made since he found her. Mason leaned forward, then caught himself. What would he say when she woke? How did you explain to a proper lady that a strange man had undressed her, was alone with her in a cabin miles from civilization? Her eyes opened suddenly, unfocused and confused. They were green, he noted absurdly, the color of spring leaves, incongruous in this world of white and gray and brown. For a moment, she stared at the ceiling. Then her gaze found him. Confusion sharpened into something else. Terror. She screamed. The sound shattered the cabin's quiet like a gunshot. She tried to sit up, realized her state of undress beneath the robe, and screamed again. Her hands clutched the buffalo hide to her throat as she scrambled backward until she hit the wall. "You're safe," Mason said, raising his hands to show they were empty. His voice came out rusty from disuse. "There was an accident. Your coach—" "Don't touch me." She pressed against the logs as if she could melt through them. "What have you? Where am I?" Her eyes found her clothing hanging by the fire, and fresh horror bloomed on her face. "You were freezing," he said carefully, as if talking to a spooked horse. "Wet clothes would have killed you. I only did what was necessary." "Necessary?" Her voice rose to near hysteria. "You're saying it was necessary to—" She couldn't finish, couldn't voice the violation she clearly felt. Mason stood slowly, moving to the far side of the cabin to give her space. "Your coach crashed in the storm. Everyone else is dead. You would have been too if I hadn't found you." The words penetrated her panic. "Everyone?" "Yes, no point softening such truth." "Mr. Harrington, Mrs. Peyton. The driver," he shook his head. "I'm sorry." The woman's face crumpled, and she began to sob. Not the delicate tears of a lady's grief, but raw, ugly tears that shook her whole body. Mason stood helpless, watching her world shatter. He remembered this part too well. The disbelief, the bargaining with God, the crushing weight when reality refused to bend. At least she had someone to witness her grief. He'd howled alone in an empty house holding his wife's cold hand until neighbors forced him to let go. When the storm of tears passed, she wiped her face with trembling hands and looked at him with eyes that had aged years in minutes. "I apologize for my outburst," she said formally, the social reflexes of her class reasserting themselves, "and for misjudging your intentions. You saved my life." "You needed saving," he said simply. "I'm Eleanor Reed," she said after a pause, "of Boston." She pulled the buffalo robe tighter, a makeshift dignity. "Mason Thorne." He didn't offer more. What else was there to say? That he was a ghost living in self-imposed exile, that he hadn't spoken to another human being in months. "Mason Thorne," she asked, suddenly her gaze sharpening. The question struck him like a physical blow. No one had called him doctor in 6 years. No one here knew that part of his life, or so he'd thought. "How did your hands," she said, nodding toward them, "the way you hold them. And those are sutures on my forehead, aren't they? I can feel them. Quite neat work for a wilderness cabin." Mason's fingers curled involuntarily as if to hide the evidence of his past. "I was a doctor, once. It doesn't matter now." Eleanor Reed studied him with unnerving intensity. "I think it mattered very much to me today, Dr. Thorne." The title felt like an accusation. Mason turned away uncomfortable under her scrutiny. "You should rest. The storm won't let up for days. You've been through an ordeal." "How long until we can reach town?" she asked, trying for a businesslike tone despite her circumstances. Mason glanced toward the window where snow had piled halfway up the glass. "Storms are not done. Could be days. Could be a week." Her composure cracked slightly. "A week? Surely you exaggerate. This is 1879, not the Dark Ages." "This is Montana," he corrected. "Storms here don't care what year it is." She absorbed this, her city mind trying to grasp the reality. No telegraphs, no rescue parties, no convenient solutions, just a strange man's cabin and the indifferent wilderness pressing in on all sides. "Then I suppose," she said with forced calm, "we'll have to make the best of an impossible situation." Mason nodded, already regretting his weakness at the crash site. He'd saved her life, yes, but at what cost to his carefully built solitude? Eleanor Reed of Boston sat in his cabin, wrapped in his buffalo robe, her presence already rewriting the rules of his existence. Outside, the storm gathered strength for another assault. Inside, two strangers faced each other across a gulf wider than the distance between Montana and Boston, the gulf between choosing to live and merely surviving. Talk. The first days tested every boundary Mason had built over 6 years. Eleanor sat rigid by the fire, the buffalo robe clutched around her like armor, while he busied himself with unnecessary tasks, checking the door's bar, adjusting rifles that didn't need adjusting, stirring stew that had already cooked through. "I need my clothes," she announced on the second morning, her Boston accent sharp as glass in the cabin's rustic air. "Still damp," Mason replied without looking at her. "Tomorrow, maybe." "This is intolerable." She shifted on the floor, wincing. "Surely you have something, a shirt, trousers, anything more appropriate than this." He did, of course, but giving her his clothes felt like another crack in his defenses. Still, the discomfort in her voice moved him. From the old trunk beneath his bed, he pulled out a flannel shirt and wool trousers, both patched but clean. "These will be too big," he warned, setting them near her. "I'll manage." She waited, expectation clear in her raised eyebrow. "I'll tend the horses," Mason muttered, grabbing his coat. Outside, the cold hit like a slap of clarity. What was he doing? This woman, this Eleanor Reed of Boston, would leave as soon as the storm broke. He just had to endure a few days of disruption. Then his life would return to its orderly emptiness. Thunder, his black stallion, nickered softly as Mason entered the lean-to stable built against the cabin's west wall. The horse seemed to sense his agitation. "Don't look at me like that," he told the animal. "I know what I'm doing." Thunder snorted, clearly unconvinced. When Mason returned, Eleanor had managed to dress herself. His clothes hung on her like a child playing dress-up, trouser cuffs rolled up several times, shirt sleeves dangling past her hands. But she sat straight, or some dignity restored. "Thank you," she said stiffly, "though I fail to understand why a simple rescue requires such primitive arrangements." "You fail to understand a lot of things," Mason shot back, patience fraying. starting with the fact that you're lucky to be breathing. Her green eyes flashed. How fortunate for me that a mountain hermit happened along. Tell me, Dr. Thorne, do you often rescue half-dead women, or am I a special occasion? First in 6 years, he said flatly, beginning to remember why I stopped. They glared at each other across the fire's glow. Then unexpectedly, Eleanor laughed a short, bitter sound. Forgive me, my mother would be appalled at my manners. Here you've saved my life, and I'm acting like a scared woman alone with a stranger, Mason finished. It's natural. Nothing about this is natural. She gestured at the cabin at him, at her ridiculous appearance in his clothes. 3 days ago, I was dining at the Palmer House in Chicago. Now I'm dressed like a lumberjack trapped in a cabin that would fit in my bedroom back home. Well, now, why were you on that coach? The question slipped out before Mason could stop it. Conversation, another rule broken. Eleanor's face closed off. Going to San Francisco. I have an aunt there. He recognized the evasion but didn't press. Everyone came west running from something. You'll need food, he said instead, ladling stew into a bowl. She accepted it warily, then took a tentative bite. Surprise flickered across her features. This is actually quite good. Venison, wild onions, cattail roots. Cattail roots. She examined her spoon with new suspicion. Won't kill you. Already saved you from freezing. Seems foolish to poison you now. Another unexpected laugh, this one warmer. I suppose that's logical in a frontier sort of way. They ate in silence, but it felt less hostile now. Eleanor finished her bowl and surprised him by asking for more. City ladies usually picked at their food like birds, but near death had a way of sharpening appetites. Where do I sleep? She asked finally, the question they had both been avoiding. Mason nodded toward the loft. Up there, I'll take the floor by the fire. That hardly seems fair. This is your home. Life's not fair, he said curtly. You need proper rest to heal. Floor's fine for me. She started to protest, then seemed to realize the futility. Rising carefully, she swayed slightly. Steadying herself against the wall, Eleanor made her way to the ladder. The climb in oversized trousers proved challenging, and Mason found himself looking away from the awkward display. Dr. Thorne, her voice drifted down from the loft. Thank you. Despite my behavior, I am grateful. He grunted acknowledgement, banking the fire for the night. But sleep eluded him. Every sound from above the creak of straw, a soft sigh, the rustle of blankets reminded him of the intruder in his sanctuary. When had another person's breathing last filled his cabin? Abigail pregnant and restless, shifting in their bed while he promised everything would be fine. Promises he couldn't keep. By dawn, exhaustion weighed on him like a physical burden. Eleanor descended the ladder more gracefully, having figured out how to manage the oversized clothes. Her hair hung in a long braid. When had she found his comb, color had returned to her cheeks. Good morning, she said formally, as if they stood in a Boston parlor rather than a mountain cabin. Mason handed her coffee, black bitter, nothing like what she probably drank from china cups. She sipped it without complaint. Another surprise. I need to check the storm, he said. See how long we're stuck. May I come? The request startled him. Why? Because I'm tired of being managed like a child. Steel entered her voice. I've spent 3 months traveling west alone, Dr. Thorne. I'm not as fragile as you assume. You nearly died yesterday. But I didn't. She met his gaze steadily. I'd like to see where I am. Understand my situation. Surely that's reasonable. Against his better judgment, Mason nodded. He found an old coat of Abigail's in the trunk when had he meant to burn that, and watched Eleanor bundle herself against the cold. Even drowning in oversized clothes, she maintained a peculiar dignity. Outside, the storm had deposited another 2 feet of snow. The world lay buried in white trees, bowed under the weight, familiar landmarks erased. Eleanor stood silent, absorbing the magnitude of their isolation. Dear God, she whispered, it's like the moon. Welcome to Montana. Mason pointed toward invisible valleys. Cedar Ridge is that way. 2 days in good weather. Billings is 5 days east. Nothing else for 100 miles. She turned in a slow circle, really seeing the wilderness for the first time. No smoke from neighboring chimneys, no church bells, no city sounds, just the vast indifference of mountains and sky. You live here alone. The question held new understanding. 6 years. Why, when he didn't answer, she pressed on. What makes a man choose this emptiness? What makes a woman run from Boston to San Francisco? He countered. Eleanor's jaw tightened. That's different. Is it? They stood in the snow, two people carrying secrets like stones. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. My fiancé, Dr. Harrison Wells. A business arrangement between our fathers sealed when I was 22. She hugged herself, the gesture protective rather than cold. I discovered something unforgivable. I left like a thief in the night. Took what money I could, bought passage west. You thought you could disappear, start over, become someone else. Bitterness colored her words. I thought I had covered my tracks well enough. Mason understood that impulse too well. The West is good for that. Lots of people out here becoming someone else. And you, her eyes held his, refusing to let him retreat. Who were you before? The question hung between them like ice crystals in the air. Mason turned back toward the cabin. Someone who learned better. That night, Eleanor spotted Mason's bookshelf. It was the only luxury in the spare cabin, a collection of medical texts and scientific journals, their leather bindings incongruous against the rough-hewn walls. May I? She asked, gesturing toward them. Mason hesitated, then nodded. Those books were the last tether to his former life, kept from some inability to sever the final tie. Eleanor ran her fingers along the spines with unexpected reverence. She selected a volume, Parker's Anatomy and Surgical Technique, 1873 edition, and opened it carefully. You've made notes, she observed, examining the margins filled with Mason's cramped handwriting. He tensed. Those annotations contained observations from his battlefield surgeries, techniques improvised under fire modifications to standard procedures necessitated by desperate conditions. Just old habits, he said dismissively, from another life. Eleanor continued studying the page. This modification to the circular amputation technique, it's brilliant. Preserves more muscle tissue for the stump, doesn't it? Better healing, better prosthetic attachment later. Mason stared at her, momentarily speechless. Few trained surgeons would have grasped the significance of that particular annotation, let alone articulated it so precisely. How do you know that? He demanded. She closed the book slowly, a shadow crossing her face. I have some medical training myself. Some training, he repeated skeptically. Women don't study medicine. Some do. Her chin lifted in that now familiar gesture of defiance. I served as a nurse at Massachusetts General for 3 years. Later, I had private instruction. Mason knew he was being evasive, but he also recognized a protective wall around her secrets. He had built similar fortifications around his own past. You're running from more than just a fiancé, he said quietly. Eleanor returned the book to its shelf, her back to him. As are you, Dr. Thorne. The observation landed too close to truth for comfort. Mason retreated to safer ground, stoking the fire with unnecessary vigor. We should check your stitches, he said, changing the subject. Eleanor sat on the wooden chair as he unwrapped the bandage from her forehead. The wound looked good, clean edges, no angry redness, suggesting infection. His fingers worked with the automatic precision of long practice cleaning and rebandaging with minimal contact. Your hands don't shake, she noted. Many surgeons develop tremors eventually. I don't perform surgery anymore. But you could. Those sutures are perfect. Mason stepped back, uncomfortable with her assessment. They'll need to come out in a week. By then the trail to Cedar Ridge should be passable. And if I don't wish to go to Cedar Ridge, the question surprised him. That's the route to San Francisco. Perhaps my plans have changed. Mason frowned. One near-death experience isn't enough to make a sensible woman choose the wilderness. You did. I'm not sensible, he said shortly, and I'm not a woman alone in hostile territory. Eleanor looked around the cabin with thoughtful eyes. Is it really so hostile? You've built something here, something solid. I built a hiding place. Mason corrected the admission, slipping out before he could stop it. From what? The fire popped loudly in the silence that followed her question. Mason moved to the window, staring out at the snow-buried world. Get some rest, Miss Reed. Tomorrow the storm might break. But the storm showed no signs of relenting. 3 days became 5 became a week. The routine they established was fragile but functional. Mason hunting when weather permitted, Eleanor keeping the cabin in order. They spoke little, each respecting the other's reticence, yet awareness of the other filled every corner of the small space. On the seventh night, Mason woke gasping from the familiar nightmare, the field hospital at Antietam, the endless stream of broken bodies, the impossible choices of triage. In the dream, as always, every face belonged to Abigail. He sat up, sweat cooling on his skin, despite the cabin's chill. The fire had burned low, casting the room in deep shadow. Mason rose silently, intending to add wood without waking Eleanor. Was it the war? Her voice came softly from the darkness above. Mason froze. I didn't mean to wake you. You didn't. I was already awake. A pause. You called out a name. Abigail. The sound of that name in a stranger's mouth struck him like a blow. Mason stood motionless, one hand on the iron poker. I'm sorry, Eleanor said into his silence. It's not my place to pry. No, he agreed, his voice rough. It's not. He built up the fire, mechanically aware of Eleanor watching from the loft. When flames leapt high again, he remained standing, unable to return to his bedroll and the dreams that waited there. I lost someone too, she offered quietly, not to death, but to something worse perhaps. Betrayal. Mason said nothing, but he didn't move away. Some perverse need to hear another's pain, to know he wasn't alone in suffering, kept him rooted before the fire. Harrison, my fiancé, was a respected physician, Eleanor continued. I admired his work before I ever met him. That's why I agreed to the marriage arrangement. I thought we would share a passion for medicine, for healing. She laughed softly, the sound hollow. Instead, I discovered he had been conducting experiments on patients without their consent. Poor women, mostly. Immigrants who couldn't protest, who didn't understand what was happening to them. Mason turned then, seeing her silhouette at the edge of the loft, knees drawn up to her chest. What kind of experiments? He asked, though he could guess. Surgical techniques, new procedures. Some had merit, scientifically speaking, but the way he went about it, she shuddered visibly. When I confronted him, he said I was being sentimental, that advancing medical knowledge required sacrifices, that women couldn't understand the greater good. Did you report him off him? I tried. To the hospital board, to the medical society. They closed ranks around him. One of them, a man who'd known me since childhood, suggested I was hysterical, that perhaps I needed treatment myself. The threat implicit in those words hung in the air between them. Mason had seen how the medical establishment treated women who stepped out of line. The treatments prescribed, from cold water therapy to surgical intervention, were often worse than the supposed ailments. So you ran, he said. I took his research journals first, Eleanor admitted. Documented evidence of what he'd done. I thought perhaps in San Francisco, far from his influence, I might find someone to listen. Mason considered her story, fitting it against what he knew of medical politics in Boston. It rang true, the arrogance of certain physicians, the casual dismissal of women's concerns, the protection offered to men of position, regardless of their actions. Your fiancé, he said carefully. Would he come after you? Eleanor's silhouette stiffened. He values his reputation above all else. If he believes I still have evidence that could damage it, yes, he would. Mason nodded, accepting this new complication. In the morning, I'll teach you to shoot. The offer surprised them both. Teaching her meant acknowledging she might need to defend herself. It meant investment in her future beyond their temporary shelter. Thank you, she said simply. Mason returned to his bedroll, but sleep remained elusive. He listened to Eleanor's breathing as it slowed and deepened, wondering what nightmares pursued her into darkness. And the shot echoed across the clearing, startling a pair of ravens from a nearby pine. The bottle remained untouched on the fence post 50 yards away. Again, Mason instructed, remember to breathe out as you squeeze the trigger. Eleanor adjusted her stance, lifted the rifle, and sighted down the barrel. Her hands were steady, her concentration absolute. She exhaled slowly and fired. The bottle exploded in a shower of glass. A smile broke across her face, the first genuine expression of joy Mason had seen from her. I did it? Good, he acknowledged. Now do it 10 more times. Her smile faltered. There are only 5 bottles left. Then you'll need to hit them twice. Mason set up more targets without further explanation. The wilderness forgave no mistakes, offered no second chances. If Eleanor needed this skill, she needed mastery, not mere acquaintance. She nodded, understanding the unspoken lesson. For the next hour, they worked in focused silence. Eleanor proved an apt pupil, her hands steady and her eye keen. By the time they finished, she could reliably hit targets at various distances. "You're a good teacher," she observed as they walked back to the cabin. Mason grunted noncommittally. "You're a good student. Most city folk can't stop flinching at the noise. I've heard louder sounds in hospital wards." The casual reference to her medical experience piqued his curiosity again. Eleanor Reed was an enigma, a Boston lady with the education of a nurse, but the knowledge of a physician fleeing a powerful fiancé with stolen research. "This aunt in San Francisco," he said. "Is she real?" Eleanor looked startled, then chuckled. "Yes, actually, my mother's sister. She's quite real, though I haven't seen her in 15 years. I doubt she'd recognize me. But she'd take you in." "I hope so." Eleanor's pace slowed. "She's my last resort, in truth. I have no other family willing to defy my father's wishes regarding my engagement." Mason considered this. "Cedar Ridge has a telegraph office. Once the trail's clear, you could send her a message before committing to the journey." "That's thoughtful of you." They walked in silence for a moment, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a transformed world of pristine white. The afternoon sun cast long blue shadows across the snowscape. "I was an army surgeon." "Oh," Mason said abruptly. The words fell into the quiet like stones into still water. "During the war." Eleanor glanced at him but didn't interrupt, sensing the rarity of his disclosure. "Antietam, Gettysburg, Cold Harbor." He named the battles like a litany of sins. "I saw more men die in 4 years than most doctors see in a lifetime. Some by enemy fire, some by disease, some by my own hands." "By your hands?" she asked softly. "Triage." The word tasted bitter. Deciding who could be found and who couldn't, who deserved the limited medicines, the limited time. He kicked at the snow. "Playing God." "That's not playing God," Eleanor objected. "That's making impossible choices in impossible circumstances." Mason shook his head. "Tell that to the men I passed over, the ones I deemed too far gone. Some of them watched me walk away knowing what it meant. You couldn't save everyone." "No, but I could have saved more." They reached the cabin, but Mason wasn't ready to go inside to return to the confined space with its weight of memories. He moved instead to the woodpile, taking up the axe. Eleanor watched as he split logs with methodical force, each stroke precise despite the emotion behind it. "What happened after the war?" she asked when his rhythm slowed. Mason set another log on the chopping block. "I came home, tried to build a normal life, opened a practice in Chicago." The axe came down, cleaving wood with a satisfying crack. "Met Abigail, married her." He fell silent, focusing on the wood. Eleanor waited, her patience a tangible thing. "She died," Mason said finally. 6 years ago, childbed fever after our son was born too early. The baby died with her." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, the simple words carrying genuine feeling. Mason split the final log with excessive force, sending fragments flying. "Sorry doesn't bring them back." "No, it doesn't." Her quiet agreement held no platitudes, no empty comfort. He gathered the split wood, suddenly exhausted. The confession had drained something from him, leaving a hollow space he didn't know how to fill. Eleanor took half the load without being asked, following him into the cabin. They worked together in silence, stacking the wood, preparing the evening meal, moving around each other with newfound awareness. Later, as darkness gathered outside, Eleanor spoke again. "Thank you for telling me about Abigail and the war." Mason looked up from the arrow he was fletching. "Why, honey?" "Because it helps me understand why you're here, why you chose this life." She gestured at the cabin, the isolation. "It wasn't just running away, it was looking for peace." The observation was too accurate to deny. Mason nodded once, acknowledging her insight. "Have you found it?" she asked. "Peace." He considered the question seriously. "Not peace, but sometimes silence when the memories aren't too loud." Eleanor's eyes held his across the firelight. "That's something, at least." It was more than he'd had in Chicago, surrounded by reminders of all he'd lost. Here in the wilderness, the ghosts seemed more distant, less demanding of his attention. Until Eleanor Reed arrived, bringing the outside world with her like an unwelcome draft through a badly sealed window. Yet as he watched her tending the fire, her movements growing more confident each day, Mason found himself less resentful of the intrusion than he'd expected. There was something companionable in their shared silence, something almost comfortable in the routine they'd established. It wouldn't last, of course. The trails would clear. Eleanor would continue to San Francisco or wherever fate took her. Mason would return to his solitude. But for now, in this strange interlude, carved out by storm and circumstance, two wounded souls had found momentary shelter in each other's company. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was something. The sound came in the darkest hour of night, a rhythmic tapping at the cabin door. Mason was instantly alert, rifle in hand, before he was fully upright. Eleanor sat up in the loft, eyes wide with alarm. "Stay there," Mason whispered, moving silently to the door. The tapping came again, followed by a voice, low, urgent, speaking in the Blackfoot tongue. Words Mason recognized after 6 years of occasional trading with the tribe. "Medicine man. Help. Blood." Mason unbarred the door cautiously, rifle ready. On his threshold stood a tall native warrior, snow dusting his shoulders and long black hair. Blood stained the man's buckskin shirt, but he remained standing through sheer force of will. "Running Elk," Mason identified the visitor. "What happened?" "Hunt," the warrior answered in halting English. "Elk horn." He gestured to his side where a massive wound gaped through the torn shirt. Mason set aside the rifle and helped the man inside. Running Elk stumbled, nearly falling as they reached the fire. Mason eased him onto the bearskin rug, quickly assessing the injury. The wound was deep, a goring from an elk's antler that had torn through muscle and possibly damaged internal organs. The kind of injury that killed men slowly if untreated. "I need light," Mason said, already reaching for his medical bag, the one he'd kept packed and ready despite his vow never to practice again. Eleanor descended the ladder swiftly. "What can I do? Boil water. Find my suture kit. There are clean cloths in the trunk." She moved without hesitation, gathering supplies with unexpected efficiency. Mason cut away the buckskin shirt, revealing the full extent of the wound. Running Elk remained stoic, his dark eyes fixed on the ceiling, lips moving in a silent prayer or chant. "He needs surgery," Mason said grimly. The horn penetrated deep, possible laceration of the liver. "Can you do it here?" Eleanor asked, setting a basin of steaming water beside him. "I have to." Mason laid out his instruments, scalpel retractors, forceps, all meticulously maintained despite years of disuse. "Hold his shoulders. This will hurt." Eleanor positioned herself at Running Elk's head, gripping his shoulders firmly. Mason offered the warrior a leather strap to bite down on, then a measure of whiskey. "Ready?" he asked both patient and assistant. Running Elk nodded once. Eleanor's face was pale but determined. "Ready." Mason worked with the focused precision that had once made him one of the most respected surgeons in the Union Army. The cabin became an operating theater, the humble table transformed by purpose and necessity. He cleaned, explored, repaired, each movement automatic and sure. Eleanor proved an invaluable assistant, anticipating his needs, sponging blood, maintaining pressure on vessels when required. Her hands never shook, her attention never wavered. She worked with the competence of someone with far more than nursing training. At one point, when Mason struggled to visualize a bleeder deep in the wound, Eleanor suggested, "If you place a retractor here and I hold this edge, the exposure would improve." Mason followed her suggestion without question. She was right, the field of view improved dramatically. He located the bleeding vessel and ligated it swiftly. "Where did you learn that?" he asked as they continued working. "Observation," she replied, focus unwavering, "and anatomy text." The procedure lasted over an hour. Running Elk remained conscious throughout, his endurance testimony to a warrior's discipline. When Mason finally placed the last suture and bandaged the wound, the native man clasped his wrist in gratitude. "Shadow healer," he said in English. "Life debt." Mason shook his head. No debt. Residue." Running Elk's eyes moved to Eleanor. "Medicine woman," he acknowledged before finally surrendering to exhaustion. Mason covered him with blankets, then stepped back, suddenly aware of the blood covering his hands and forearms. The familiar sight brought a rush of memories. The field of hospitals, the endless surgeries, the smell of death that no amount of carbolic acid could mask. He moved to the basin, scrubbing vigorously as if he could wash away the past along with the blood. Eleanor joined him, her own hands stained crimson. You did well, oh, Mason said quietly. So did you. She studied him as they cleaned up. Your hands never hesitated. Not once. Muscle memory. More than that, you haven't forgotten anything. Eleanor dried her hands on a clean cloth. Why did he call you Shadow Healer? Mason shrugged. I've treated some of the Blackfoot over the years. Hunting accidents, childbirth complications. They come to the cabin at night usually. Don't want the Indian agent knowing they're seeking white man's medicine. And you help them. When I can. Eleanor looked at Running Elk's sleeping form, then back to Mason. For someone who claims to have given up medicine, you keep a well-stocked surgical kit. The observation was too accurate to deflect. Mason busied himself cleaning his instruments, a task that required focus and precision. Some habits are hard to break, he admitted finally. Is that all it is? Habit? Mason set down the scalpel he had been polishing. What do you want me to say? Misread that I'm a hypocrite, that I claim to have abandoned medicine while secretly practicing on the natives. I want you to admit that you're still a doctor, she said simply. Despite everything you've lost, despite your exile, that part of you remains. The truth of her words struck too close to home. Mason turned away, unable to face her perceptive gaze. Get some rest, he said, retreating to familiar gruffness. Dawn comes early, and we have a patient to monitor. Eleanor didn't push further, for which Mason was grateful. She returned to the loft, leaving him alone with Running Elk's steady breathing and the weight of her insight. Mason settled into his chair, prepared to keep vigil through the night. But his mind wouldn't quiet. Eleanor Reed had seen through his carefully constructed facade with disturbing ease. She'd recognized the doctor still living within the hermit, the healer hiding behind the hunter. What else did those green eyes see? How much of his pain, his guilt, his longing for redemption was visible to her? The thought was unsettling. More unsettling still was her own revelation, not in words but in action. Eleanor Reed was no mere nurse with some medical training. Her assistants during Running Elk's surgery had been too skilled, too confident. She knew procedures and techniques that weren't taught to nurses or even medical students. She had the hands and eyes of a surgeon. Yet women weren't admitted to medical schools, weren't granted licenses to practice. The few female physicians Mason knew of had studied in Europe or at the rare women's medical colleges that had opened after the war. Who exactly was Eleanor Reed? And what was in those research journals she'd stolen from her fiancé? As if sensing his thoughts running, Elk stirred, dark eyes opening to find Mason's. Medicine woman, the warrior said, glancing toward the loft. She carries power. Yes, Mason agreed quietly. I believe she does. Running Elk nodded, satisfied with this acknowledgement. Two healers, same lodge. Good medicine. Mason didn't correct him. There was no point explaining the temporary nature of their arrangement, the inevitability of Eleanor's departure once the trails cleared. Instead, he checked the Blackfoot's bandages and offered water, falling easily into the role of physician, despite his years of denial. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the promise of morning. Another day in this strange interlude, another day of pretending that Eleanor Reed hadn't awakened something in him that he'd thought long dead. Not just the doctor. Something else. Something more frightening. Hope. Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and the low murmur of voices. Morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, casting golden rectangles across the rough-hewn floor. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself in the now familiar loft. 2 weeks had passed since the stagecoach accident. 2 weeks of adapting to a life she could never have imagined in Boston, learning to split wood to identify edible plants to shoot with deadly accuracy. 2 weeks of watching Dr. Mason Thorne wrestle with his demons while pretending he wasn't still every inch the physician he'd once been. A week tonight's emergency surgery had shattered that pretense. The skilled surgeon had emerged from behind the mountain man's facade, revealing the truth Eleanor had suspected from the beginning. Mason Thorne hadn't stopped being a doctor. He'd only stopped admitting it, perhaps even to himself. She descended the ladder to find Mason changing Running Elk's bandages. The Blackfoot warrior sat stoically as deft fingers examined the healing wound. Good edges, Mason commented. No sign of infection. Running Elk nodded. Shadow Healer's medicine strong. Good morning, Eleanor said, approaching the men. Running Elk inclined his head respectfully. Medicine woman. The title still disconcerted her. In Boston, she'd been forced to hide her medical knowledge to present herself as merely a nurse, despite years of private study and unofficial apprenticeship. Here in this wilderness cabin, a Blackfoot warrior acknowledged what the medical establishment of the eastern seaboard refused to see. "How are you feeling?" she asked, kneeling to examine the wound herself. "Strong," Running Elk answered. "Heartbeats for 2 healers now." Mason finished securing the fresh bandage. "He'll need to stay another day at least. That wound was deep." "My people search soon," Running Elk said, "when no return from hunt." "We'll keep watch," Mason assured him. "If they come, we'll signal." Eleanor poured coffee for the 3 of them, the domestic gesture now automatic after days of shared routine. Mason accepted the cup with a nod, their fingers brushing briefly. The small contact sent an unexpected warmth through her, startling in its intensity. She moved away quickly, unsettled by her reaction. This was not part of the plan. Eleanor had fled Boston to escape one physician's control, not to develop feelings for another, especially one as wounded and withdrawn as Mason Thorne. Yet she couldn't deny the growing awareness between them. It manifested in small ways: the carefulness with which they navigated the cabin's limited space, the lingering glances across the fire in the evenings, the increasing ease of their conversations. Last night, working together to save Running Elk, they had moved like partners, long accustomed to each other's rhythms. Mason hadn't questioned her knowledge or skills, hadn't treated her as merely an assistant. He had accepted her as an equal in the work of healing. That acceptance, more than anything, had touched something deep within Eleanor. In Boston, she'd fought constantly for recognition, for the right to use her mind and hands in service of medicine. Here in this unlikely operating theater, Mason had simply assumed her competence. "The wound needs cleaning again tonight," Mason said, interrupting her thoughts. "And we should check for signs of internal bleeding." Eleanor nodded. "His pulse is strong, respiration's normal. I don't think we need to worry about significant hemorrhage." Running Elk watched this exchange with interest. 2 healers, same mind, he observed. Strong medicine. Mason's expression tightened, and he rose abruptly. "I need to check the traps." He grabbed his coat and rifle, leaving before Eleanor could respond. The sudden departure felt like a retreat, though, from what she wasn't certain. Running Elk chuckled softly. "Shadow healer fears." "Fears what?" Eleanor asked, curious about the native man's perception. "Woman's medicine." Running Elk's dark eyes held wisdom beyond his years. "Man walks alone long time, forgets how to walk beside another." The insight was surprisingly perceptive. Eleanor considered it as she tidied the cabin, putting away the medical supplies from the night before. Mason's solitude wasn't merely physical, but spiritual, a deliberate isolation of the heart as much as the body. She found herself drawn to his bookshelf again, examining the volumes with new appreciation after witnessing his surgical skill. Among the medical texts were journals dating back to the war, personal records of cases, techniques, observations. The handwriting was cramped but precise, the clinical notes interspersed with more personal reflections. One entry from 1863 caught her eye. "Performed 23 amputations today. Lost 7, better than yesterday. Modified the circular technique for JS. Cavalry right thigh compound fracture from shell fragment. Preserved more muscle tissue for better stump formation. Patient survived procedure. Will observe for infection." The notation was followed by detailed sketches of the modified technique, the same one she'd commented on days earlier. Eleanor turned the page, finding follow-up notes on the patient's recovery and eventual fitting with a prosthetic limb. These weren't merely clinical records. They were the observations of a physician deeply invested in his patient's outcomes, constantly seeking to improve techniques to reduce suffering, to increase survival. Eleanor closed the journal carefully, returning it to its place. The man who had written those pages hadn't abandoned medicine in his heart, only in his practice. The healer remained buried beneath grief and guilt, but not destroyed. Running Elk watched her from his place by the fire. "You see Shadow Healer's heart," he stated rather than asked. "I see his pain," Eleanor corrected. "Same thing." The warrior adjusted his position with a slight wince. "Man's pain, man's heart cannot separate." Eleanor considered this as she prepared a healing tea from the herbs Mason had shown her. The native philosophy saw connection where Western medicine insisted on separation, body from spirit, disease from patient, doctor from emotion. Perhaps Running Elk was right. Perhaps Mason's pain and his healing gift were inseparable, two aspects of the same essential self. When Mason returned hours later laden with the rabbits from his traps, Eleanor was rebandaging Running Elk's wound. She worked with quiet confidence, her movements precise and practiced. Mason stood in the doorway watching, struck by the tableau before him. Eleanor kneeling beside the native warrior, firelight gilding her profile as she tied off the bandage with a surgeon's knot. She'd adapted to this primitive setting with surprising grace, her Boston manners giving way to frontier practicality. She looked up, sensing his presence. Successful hunt. Mason held up the rabbits in answer. We'll eat well tonight. He moved to the table to clean his catch, falling into the familiar routine. Eleanor finished with Running Elk and joined him, taking up a knife to help with the preparation. They worked in companionable silence, the domesticity of the scene at odds with the temporary nature of their arrangement. I found your war journals, Eleanor said finally, her voice carefully neutral. Mason's hand stilled. You shouldn't have been looking through my things. They were on the shelf with the other books. She continued skinning a rabbit, her technique improving with practice. Your surgical innovations were remarkable. That modified amputation technique saved many lives, I imagine. Not enough. The response was automatic, worn smooth like a river stone by years of regret. You couldn't save everyone. You said that before. It bears repeating. Eleanor set down her knife, forcing him to meet her gaze. Medicine has limits, Mason. Even the best physicians lose patience. The use of his given name startled him. They had maintained formal address despite their increasingly informal circumstances. Is that what you tell yourself? He asked. When you remember the women your fiancé experimented on? The question was deliberately provocative, a deflection from his own vulnerability. Eleanor flinched visibly but didn't retreat. No, she said quietly. I tell myself I should have acted sooner. Should have seen the signs before so many suffered. Her green eyes held his unflinching. Just as you tell yourself you should have saved more soldiers, should have prevented Abigail's infection, should have known better somehow. The accuracy of her insight left Mason momentarily speechless. She had named his guilt precisely not just for the deaths he couldn't prevent, but for the one that mattered most, for failing to save his wife and child despite all his knowledge, all his skill. My journals don't mention Abigail, then he said finally. They don't need to. I recognize the pattern. Eleanor resumed her work, allowing him the dignity of composure. Physicians who lose patients they love often blame their own skill, their own judgment. They forget that they too are humans subject to the same limitations as any doctor. Is that professional insight, Miss Reed? The formality was deliberate, an attempt to reestablish distance. You speak as more than a nurse. Eleanor's hand stilled. A moment of decision crossed her face. I studied medicine privately for 5 years with Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell after my time as a nurse. She trained me as she would any physician, though I could never be licensed. The admission explained much: her knowledge of anatomy, her surgical aptitude, her confidence in medical discussions. Your fiancé knew this. He encouraged it initially, said I would be useful in his practice. Bitterness tinged her voice. What he meant was I could assist with his experiments without the ethical qualms of a proper physician. Mason absorbed this new information, reassessing Eleanor Reed yet again. Not just a nurse fleeing an unwanted marriage, but a trained doctor denied recognition because of her sex. Your Blackwell must have been impressed with your abilities, he said finally. She doesn't waste time on incapable students. The simple acknowledgement of her training brought a flush to Eleanor's cheeks. You know of Elizabeth. We corresponded during the war. Her observations on hospital hygiene saved many lives. Mason returned to preparing the rabbits. She mentioned training women physicians. I didn't realize she did so privately as well as at her college. Only in special cases. Eleanor's voice held pride mingled with old frustration. She believed I had potential worth nurturing despite the barriers. She was right. The quiet affirmation hung between them, changing something in the cabin's atmosphere. Mason hadn't meant to offer it, hadn't planned to acknowledge what he'd observed during Running Elk's surgery, but the truth had escaped before he could contain it. Eleanor Reed was a physician in all but license. A healer denied her proper role by the conventions of a society that valued tradition over talent. Running Elk spoke from his place by the fire. Two healers, different paths, same destination. Mason glanced at the Blackfoot warrior who had been listening to their exchange with evident interest. And what destination is that? Helping the wounded, easing pain. Running Elk's dark eyes held ancient wisdom. Medicine calls, healer answers. Man, woman, no difference to the spirits. Eleanor smiled at the native man. Your people are wiser than mine, it seems. Different wisdom. Running Elk shrugged. Your people build big medicine houses, make strong drugs. My people know plant spirits, body's own healing. Both approaches have merit, Mason found himself saying. I've learned much from your people's herbal knowledge. Running Elk nodded, pleased with this acknowledgement. Shadow healer listens. Most white doctors no listen. The observation struck close to Mason's own experience. His interest in native medicine had been dismissed by colleagues in Chicago as primitive superstition. Yet he'd seen remarkable results from treatments Western medicine rejected without examination. That's changing, Eleanor said. Slowly, some physicians are beginning to study traditional remedies more seriously. You among them? Mason asked, curious about her views. I believe in evidence and observation. Eleanor's expression grew animated, professional passion overcoming personal reserve. If a treatment works, it deserves study regardless of its origin. Medicine should be empirical, not ideological. It was the argument Mason himself had made years ago before disillusionment and grief drove him from the profession. Hearing it from Eleanor awakened old convictions he'd thought long buried. Your research journals, he said, the ones you took from your fiancé, what do they contain? Eleanor hesitated, wariness returning to her eyes. Evidence of his experiments, records of procedures performed without consent, but also, she paused, choosing her words carefully, also my own work. Observations on preventing surgical infection through improved hygiene and antiseptic techniques. Lister's methods, Mason asked, referring to the British surgeon whose antiseptic principles were gaining acceptance. Similar but with modifications. Pride entered her voice despite her caution. I developed a protocol that reduced post-surgical infection by nearly 70% in the cases where I was permitted to implement it. 70%. Mason couldn't hide his surprise. Such a reduction would save countless lives if widely adopted. Yes, but Harrison took credit for the work, published it under his name in the Boston Medical Journal while I was visiting my father in New York. Eleanor's hands clenched around the knife she held. When I confronted him, he said no one would believe a woman had developed such techniques. That publishing under my name would doom the protocol to obscurity and cost lives. And you accepted this? Mason found it hard to believe someone of Eleanor's evident determination would surrender so easily. No. A fierce light entered her eyes. I went to the journal editor with proof the work was mine. Notes in my handwriting dated before Harrison's supposed discovery. The editor refused to publish a retraction, but agreed to an addendum acknowledging my contribution. Harrison didn't take that well, I imagine. He was furious, called me ungrateful, hysterical, threatened to have me committed for mental instability. Eleanor set down the knife, the memory clearly still raw. That night, I took the original research journals and left. I couldn't prove his experimental abuses without them, and I couldn't leave such evidence where he might destroy it. The full picture of Eleanor's flight emerged now, not just escaping an unwanted marriage, but protecting evidence of medical misconduct while trying to preserve her own scientific contribution. These journals, Mason said slowly, they're with your belongings from the stagecoach. Eleanor nodded. In my trunk, if it survived the crash. We should retrieve it. Mason made the decision instantly. Tomorrow, if the weather holds, those records could be important. Important to whom? Eleanor studied him with cautious hope. I've tried official channels, Mason. The medical establishment protects its own. Important to medicine, he clarified. To patients, to preventing unnecessary suffering. He met her gaze directly. And important to you. They're your life's work. The acknowledgement brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, but not before Mason saw the impact of his simple recognition. Thank you, she said softly. Mason nodded, uncomfortable with her gratitude. He returned to preparing the rabbits, but something had shifted between them. A new understanding, a shared purpose beyond mere survival. Running Elk watched this exchange with the patient observation of a hunter. Medicine woman fights for truth, he noted. Shadow Healer remembers his path. Neither physician contradicted him. Some truths required no confirmation. Outside, the afternoon sun glinted on snow, turning the world to diamond brilliance. The path to the stagecoach wreck would be clear tomorrow. What they would find there, what decisions would follow, remained to be seen. For now, it was enough that two healers had recognized each other across the divide of gender background and personal tragedy. Enough that the possibility of purpose had entered a cabin long dedicated to mere existence. Running Elk smiled at the unspoken current between them. Good medicine, he said simply. Very good medicine. And despite everything, Mason found himself agreeing. Dawn broke clear and cold over Blackfoot Valley. The storm had finally retreated, leaving behind a transformed landscape of pristine white. Mason stood on the cabin porch studying the horizon where the mountains cut jagged lines against the pale sky. The path to the stagecoach wreck would be passable today. Difficult but not impossible. He glanced back through the open door. Eleanor knelt beside Running Elk, changing his bandage with practiced efficiency. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid, her borrowed clothes worn with a dignity that transcended their roughness. In 2 weeks, she had adapted to this harsh environment with surprising grace, shedding Boston proprieties like an unnecessary coat. Mason found himself watching her hands, steady, precise, confident in their work. A surgeon's hands denied their proper purpose by the accident of gender. The injustice of it struck him anew. Eleanor Reed possessed skills that could save countless lives, yet the medical establishment relegated her to the shadows to borrowed authority and stolen moments of practice. Running Elk said something that made Eleanor laugh, the sound bright in the morning stillness. Mason couldn't remember the last time laughter had filled his cabin. Before Abigail, certainly. Perhaps never. We should leave soon, he said, returning to practical matters. The sun will soften the snow by midday. Better to retrieve your trunk while the surface remains firm. Eleanor looked up, nodding. I've prepared provisions. Running Elk has agreed to remain here until we return. The Blackfoot warrior raised a hand in confirmation. Guard Medicine Lodge. Keep fire. Mason gathered their supplies, rifle rope, extra ammunition, medical kit. Eleanor donned Abigail's coat and the fur-lined boots Mason had fashioned for her from an old bearskin. They were ungainly but warm, practical, in a way her city footwear had not been. Ready? Mason asked, securing his pack. Eleanor nodded, determination replacing apprehension in her eyes. Ready. They set out across the snow-covered valley, following the trail Mason had broken during his rescue of Eleanor. Though the sky was clear, the air held a bitter chill that nipped at exposed skin and crystallized their breath. They moved in silence, conserving energy for the difficult trek. Mason led the way, breaking through occasional drifts, setting a pace Eleanor could maintain. He found himself impressed by her endurance. 2 weeks ago, she had been near death in the snow. Today, she matched his stride with quiet determination, never complaining, despite the challenging terrain. You adapt quickly, he observed during a brief rest. Eleanor took a sip from the canteen, her cheeks flushed with exertion and cold. Necessity is a thorough teacher. Most city folk take longer to adjust. I've never been one to waste time lamenting circumstances I cannot change. She handed back the canteen, her gaze direct. Besides, there's a certain honesty to this life. The wilderness doesn't pretend. It simply is. The observation struck Mason with its accuracy. Here amid the mountains and forests, pretense fell away. Survival demanded truth from the land, from oneself. Perhaps that was why he had sought refuge here after Abigail's death. Not just isolation, but clarity. They continued their journey, cresting a ridge that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. Eleanor paused, taking in the vista of snow-blanketed pines and distant peaks. It's beautiful, she said softly. Terrible and beautiful at once. Mason nodded, seeing the landscape through her eyes, the stark grandeur, the immensity that diminished human concerns. The Blackfoot believed these mountains hold spirits, that they watch over the valleys, judge the hearts of those who pass through. What do they think of your heart, I wonder? The question seemed to surprise even Eleanor, slipping out unbidden. Mason didn't answer immediately, watching an eagle circle overhead. They call me Shadow Healer. I think they see more clearly than I do. The shadows or the healing? Eleanor asked. Both, perhaps. He adjusted his pack, uncomfortable with the personal turn of conversation. We should keep moving. The wreck is just beyond that stand of pines. They descended in silence, each lost in private thoughts. The stagecoach came into view as they rounded the copse, a dark wound in the white landscape. In the 2 weeks since the accident, snow had partially buried the wreckage, softening its broken edges into ghostly shapes. Eleanor stopped abruptly, her face paling. This was the first time she had seen the sight consciously, the first confrontation with the physical evidence of her narrow escape. The others, she said quietly. What happened to them? I buried them, Mason answered. The day after I brought you to the cabin. It was the best I could do with the ground frozen. Gratitude flickered across her features. Thank you, that was more than most would have done. Mason shrugged off the acknowledgement. No one deserves to be left for the scavengers. They approached the wreckage cautiously. Mason searched for signs of predators that might have been drawn to the site, but the snow showed only the tracks of smaller creatures. Foxes, rabbits, a single wolf that had investigated but moved on. The stagecoach lay on its side, one wheel broken completely, another still attached at an odd angle. Snow had drifted inside through the shattered windows and open door. Eleanor circled the vehicle, stopping at what had once been the roof, now a vertical wall. My trunk was secured on top, she said, examining the straps and hooks still visible. If it wasn't thrown clear in the crash. Mason followed her gaze, spotting a dark rectangular shape half buried in snow several yards away. There. They trudged through the drifts, sinking knee-deep in places. The trunk had landed upright, its sturdy construction withstanding both the impact and the subsequent storm. Mason brushed away the snow, revealing brass fittings in dark leather, expensive luggage, built to endure ocean voyages and transcontinental journeys. It's intact, Eleanor said, relief evident in her voice. She knelt beside it, fingers tracing the ornate ER monogrammed on the lid. Mason examined the lock. Do you have the key? Eleanor reached beneath her collar, withdrawing a small key on a chain around her neck. I never take it off. The lock turned smoothly despite its exposure to the elements. Eleanor raised the lid carefully, revealing neatly packed contents. Clothing, books, personal items. On top lay a leather portfolio secured with string. The journals, she explained, lifting it reverently. Everything I've worked for. Everything Harrison tried to steal. Mason helped her search through the remaining contents, identifying items worth salvaging. Most of the clothing was impractical for Montana winters, but the books, writing materials, and medical instruments were valuable additions to the cabin's sparse resources. We can't carry it all, he said, assessing their capacity. The journals, your instruments, anything else essential. We'll wrap them in oilcloth to keep them dry. Eleanor nodded, making quick decisions about what to save and what to leave. Her choices were practical, unsentimental, the actions of a woman focused on survival rather than comfort. As they prepared to depart, Eleanor took a final look at the stagecoach. I should have died there, she said quietly. By all medical probability, I should have died. But you didn't. No. She turned to face him, something new in her expression, a certainty, a purpose. Perhaps there's a reason for that. Mason secured their salvaged items in his pack. Reason implies a plan. I've found the universe less organized in its intentions. Not a divine plan, Eleanor clarified. A human one. A choice. She touched the portfolio containing her journals. These contain work that could save lives. What if my survival means they're meant to reach those who can implement them? The idea of providence made Mason uncomfortable. He had abandoned such notions in blood-soaked field hospitals, where good men died screaming, while others, less deserving, survived. We make our own meaning, he said finally. If your research saves lives, it won't be because fate preserved you. It will be because you fought to bring it forward. Eleanor considered his words, then nodded slowly. Perhaps you're right, agency over destiny. It's all we can count on. Mason shouldered the pack. We should start back. The weather can change quickly here. They began their return journey, moving faster now that their mission was accomplished. As they crested the ridge again, Mason paused, studying the sky to the west. Dark clouds gathered over the distant peaks, promising another storm by nightfall. We need to hurry, he said, pointing toward the approaching weather. That front will bring snow within hours. They quickened their pace, descending the ridge in long strides that sometimes became controlled slides in the deeper snow. Eleanor kept up admirably, her face set in determined lines despite evident fatigue. Halfway back to the cabin, Mason noticed her slowing her breathing, becoming labored. He cursed himself for pushing too hard. 2 weeks of recovery wasn't enough to restore full strength after such a close brush with death. "We'll rest here," he said, indicating a fallen log cleared of snow by overhanging branches. Eleanor sank onto it gratefully, though pride kept her from acknowledging exhaustion. "The storm is still distant. We have time." Mason handed her the canteen, studying her with clinical eyes. Her color was high, but from exertion rather than fever. No signs of frostbite on exposed skin. Still, the journey had taxed her more than she would admit. "When we reach the cabin," he said, "I want to check your stitches. Make sure they're healing properly." She touched her forehead where the wound had closed to a neat line. "They feel fine. You do excellent work, doctor." "So do you." The acknowledgement came easily now. "Your assistance with running elk was impressive." Eleanor accepted the compliment with a slight nod. "Elizabeth, Dr. Blackwell insisted I learn surgical techniques despite the barriers to practicing them. She believed change would come eventually." She's an optimist. She's a realist with extraordinary patience. Eleanor's expression softened with affection for her mentor. She understood that progress happens in increments, not revolutions, that each qualified woman who proves her abilities chips away at prejudice. Mason considered this perspective. During his medical training and Army service, he had given little thought to the exclusion of women from the profession. It was simply the established order, unquestioned and unremarkable. Only after meeting Abigail, whose intelligence and observation often surpassed his colleagues, had he begun to recognize the waste of potential. His wife had assisted in his Chicago practice, developing a particular skill with pediatric patients that many male physicians lacked. Yet she had never been permitted to formalize her knowledge, to claim professional status for her contributions. "Your mentor is right about incremental change," he said finally, "though I suspect it offers cold comfort to those caught in the transition." "It doesn't," Eleanor admitted, "but the work itself provides purpose. The knowledge that each patient helped each technique improved matters regardless of who receives credit." The selflessness of this view impressed Mason. Eleanor sought recognition not for personal glory, but to ensure her medical advances would be adopted, would save lives that might otherwise be lost. "Your antiseptic protocol," he said, 70% reduction in infections is remarkable. How did you achieve it?" The question transformed Eleanor, professional passion, eclipsing fatigue. She outlined her methods, a combination of Lister's carbolic acid techniques, rigorous hand-washing procedures, and environmental controls she had developed through careful observation and documentation. Mason listened with growing interest. Her approach addressed several weaknesses he had identified in standard antiseptic practice, particularly regarding surgical instrument preparation and wound dressing. "Have you considered publishing under a male pseudonym?" he asked when she finished. "Many female authors do so to circumvent prejudice." Harrison suggested the same thing. Eleanor said, her expression hardening. "He offered to help me publish, meaning he would control the work, decide what was shared and when. I refused. There are ethical physicians who might assist without such conditions." "Perhaps." She rose from the log, ready to continue their journey. "But I'm tired of shadows and half measures. If my work has value, it should stand on its own merit, not borrowed authority." Mason respected her principle, even as he recognized its practical challenges. The medical establishment changed slowly, its traditions and hierarchies resistant to disruption from any quarter, let alone from women seeking entry to its exclusive ranks. They resumed walking, the dark clouds drawing closer. The air had changed, taking on the metallic scent that preceded snow. Mason estimated they had perhaps 2 hours before the storm reached them, enough time to reach the cabin if they maintained their pace. "Tell me about Abigail," Eleanor said suddenly, breaking the silence between them. The request caught Mason off guard. Few people dared speak his wife's name to him, treating her memory as forbidden territory. Yet Eleanor's tone held no morbid curiosity, only genuine interest. "What do you want to know?" he asked cautiously. "Whatever you wish to share." Her eyes remained forward, giving him space within the conversation. She must have been remarkable to be loved so deeply. Mason walked several paces before answering, sorting through memories he usually kept tightly contained. "She was unexpected," he said finally. "I met her at a medical lecture in Chicago, one of the few open to public attendance. She asked questions that revealed more understanding than most of the physicians present. Afterwards, she apologized for speaking out of turn, but her eyes held no true regret. The memory brought a ghost of a smile. I asked to call on her the next day. Her father was scandalized Abigail had already refused two suitable matches, but she accepted. She recognized a kindred spirit, Eleanor suggested. Perhaps, or simply someone who didn't dismiss her intelligence as unseemly in a woman. Mason ducked beneath a low-hanging branch. We were married 6 months later. She assisted in my practice, particularly with women and children who found her less intimidating than a male physician. She had natural talent and learned judgment. She could diagnose childhood ailments faster than I could develop treatments that worked when textbook approaches failed. Pride mingled with old grief in his voice. She would have made an exceptional physician. Yet she never sought formal training. The women's medical colleges were just being established then. We discussed it, but he paused, remembering. She said she preferred our partnership, the freedom to learn and practice without institutional constraints. Eleanor nodded, understanding. Many women find more liberty in informal arrangements than in institutions designed to limit them while appearing to include them. The insight matched Abigail's own words so closely that Mason glanced at Eleanor in surprise. Despite their different backgrounds, the two women shared a pragmatic approach to navigating a world that underestimated them. She would have liked you, he said without thinking. Eleanor's step faltered momentarily. I'm honored you think so. They walked in companionable silence until the cabin came into view, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin column against the darkening sky. Running Elk had maintained the fire as promised. Home, Eleanor said softly, then looked embarrassed by the slip. I mean your home. Mason found himself unexpectedly moved by her correction. In just 2 weeks, the cabin had begun to feel different, with Eleanor's presence more alive, less a mausoleum to past grief. It's shelter, he said, neither confirming nor contradicting her sentiment. For both of us for now. Running Elk greeted them at the door, his dark eyes assessing their condition and the approaching storm in one comprehensive glance. Return in time. Sky spirits bring more snow soon. How are you feeling? Eleanor asked, medical concern, replacing travel fatigue. Strong. The warrior gestured to his side. Good medicine works. Mason helped Eleanor unpack their salvaged items, while Running Elk prepared a stew from provisions they had left him. The domestic scene struck Mason with its strangeness, his isolated cabin transformed into a place of community, however temporary. Eleanor unwrapped her medical journals, carefully checking each volume for damage. Finding them intact, she selected one and offered it to Mason. My antiseptic protocols, she explained. I'd value your professional opinion. The gesture of trust was significant. These journals represented not just her research, but her future evidence of both her capabilities and her fiancé's misconduct. Mason accepted the volume with appropriate gravity. I'll review it thoroughly. As promised, the storm arrived by nightfall. Wind howled around the cabin's sturdy walls, driving snow against the windows in hissing sheets. Inside, firelight created a warm circle that held the three occupants in a bubble of shared comfort. Eleanor read aloud from a book of poetry they had salvaged from her trunk, Tennyson's verses, filling the cabin with rhythms and images from another world. Running Elk listened attentively, appreciating the cadence even when the meaning eluded him. Mason pretended to focus on cleaning his rifle, but found himself caught by the rise and fall of Eleanor's voice, the way the poetry seemed to flow through her rather than merely from her. When she finished, Running Elk nodded approval. Words like singing, good medicine for night spirits. Poetry is a kind of medicine, Eleanor agreed, for the spirit if not the body. All connected, the warrior said with certainty. Body-spirit, one circle. White doctors separate. Blackfoot healers know better. Mason had heard similar sentiments from native healers over the years. Their holistic approach contrasted sharply with Western medicine's increasing compartmentalization. Yet his own experience suggested the Blackfoot perspective held wisdom. He had seen patients with identical physical conditions respond differently based on their mental state, their will to recover, their spiritual beliefs. The best physicians recognize those connections, Eleanor said, glancing at Mason, even when medical training teaches otherwise. Mason felt her gaze like a physical touch. Did she see in him that integration of approaches? He wasn't certain it existed. His retreat to the wilderness had been a severing, not a synthesis, an abandonment of medicine rather than its reconciliation with broader understanding. Yet in recent days, treating Eleanor's injuries and running Elk's wound, he had drawn on both his formal training and the knowledge gleaned from years among the Blackfoot. Perhaps some integration had occurred despite his intentions. Running Elk rose carefully, testing his strength. Sleep now. Healing continues in dreams. Eleanor helped him arrange his bedding near the fire, checking his wound one final time before retiring to the loft. Mason remained below ostensibly to keep watch over their session, but truthfully to avoid the intimacy of shared space above. The cabin settled into night rhythms, the pop and hiss of burning logs, the moan of wind through pine boughs, the occasional creak of timbers adjusting to temperature changes. Mason opened Eleanor's journal, intending to review her antiseptic protocols with professional detachment. Her handwriting surprised him, not the flowery script taught to genteel women, but the precise economical hand of a physician trained to record observations clearly. The content impressed him even more. Eleanor's methods were meticulously documented, her conclusions supported by carefully tabulated results. The work reflected a scientific mind of the first order, rigorous and innovative simultaneously. Mason lost himself in her research, making mental notes of techniques he could have applied during the war approaches that might have saved limbs and lives lost to infection. The 70% reduction, she claimed, was if anything understated based on the evidence presented. He was so absorbed that he didn't notice Eleanor's return until she spoke from the ladder. "What do you think?" she asked softly, mindful of Running Elk's sleeping form. Mason looked up, momentarily disoriented by the transition from intellectual engagement to her physical presence. She had braided her hair for sleep, the dark plait hanging over one shoulder of the nightgown salvaged from her trunk. The firelight caught amber highlights in her eyes, transforming them from merely green to something more complex. "It's excellent work," he said, professional appreciation steadying his voice. "Rigorous methodology, clear documentation, reproducible techniques. Any reputable medical journal would publish it in an instant." If the author were male, she added without bitterness, simply stating fact. "Yes." He closed the journal carefully. "Your fiancé recognized its value. That's why he tried to claim it. Harrison has always valued advancement over ethics." Eleanor descended the ladder, moving to sit across from him by the fire. "He believes the ends justify the means, that medical progress excuses any methods used to achieve it, including experimenting on unwitting patients. He would say those women benefited from procedures they couldn't have afforded otherwise, that their ignorance protected them from unnecessary fear." Disgust colored her tone, as if dignity and informed choice were luxuries rather than fundamental rights. Mason had known physicians with similar attitudes during the war, men who viewed patients as problems to solve rather than people to heal. Such doctors often made important technical advances, but left trails of unnecessary suffering in their wake. "Your evidence against him," he said carefully. "Would it be enough for formal charges?" Eleanor shook her head. "The medical society would close ranks. The women involved are immigrants, most without legal status or English language skills. Their testimony would be dismissed. Then why take the journals? Why risk your safety? Because the truth deserves to exist, even if justice doesn't follow immediately." Her gaze held absolute conviction. And because the antiseptic protocols could save lives if properly implemented, regardless of who receives credit. The selflessness of her motivation humbled Mason. While he had retreated from medicine nursing private wounds, Eleanor had risked everything to preserve knowledge that could alleviate suffering. "The work deserves recognition," he said. "Your name should be on it?" "Perhaps someday," she smiled faintly. "Elizabeth always says we must think in generations, not years. The women studying medicine now may face barriers, but they create paths for those who follow. Cold comfort for the pioneers. True pioneers find warmth and purpose, not comfort." Eleanor's expression softened. "But enough about my journals. Tell me why you haven't slept properly since I arrived." The personal question caught Mason off guard. "I sleep enough." "You don't. I hear you pacing at night, stoking the fire when it doesn't need tending." Her tone was matter-of-fact rather than accusing. "Nightmares." Mason considered deflecting but found himself unwilling to dismiss her concern with falsehoods. "Sometimes. Old habits from the war. Nothing important. Sleep deprivation affects judgment, slows reflexes, impairs cognitive function. The physician in her emerged clinical and direct. Not ideal qualities for survival in this environment. I've managed for 6 years. Managed, yes, but at what cost? Eleanor leaned forward, the fire illuminating her features. Mason, I've treated soldiers with battle fatigue. I recognize the signs. The use of his given name, still rare between them, emphasized the shift from formal to personal concern. Mason found himself unable to maintain the emotional distance he preferred. The dreams are persistent, he admitted, not always about the war, sometimes about Abigail, the night she died. Eleanor waited, offering silent space for whatever he chose to share. She developed childbed fever after our son was stillborn. Mason continued, the words coming with difficulty. I recognized the symptoms immediately. Started treatments, cool compresses, willow bark for fever, cleansing Kaye in the womb as current practice dictated. He stared into the fire, seeing not flames but Abigail's face contorted with pain. Nothing helped. The infection spread too quickly. By the third day, she was delirious with fever, her pulse thready and rapid. I knew she wouldn't survive the night. You did everything possible, Eleanor said softly. Everything except the one thing she asked of me. Mason's voice dropped to a whisper. She had moments of lucidity near the end. Begged me to stop her suffering, to help her go quickly rather than endure hours more of agony. Understanding dawned in Eleanor's eyes. And you couldn't. I couldn't, he confirmed. Not even when she pleaded. Not even when she cried that I was cruel to force her to endure. His hands clenched involuntarily. I was a coward. I let her suffer until the end because I couldn't bear to be the instrument of her death, even as an act of mercy. The confession hung in the air between them, the first time Mason had spoken these thoughts aloud. He expected judgment, perhaps disgust at his weakness. Instead, Eleanor reached across the space between them, covering his clenched fist with her hand. That wasn't cowardice, Mason. It was love. He shook his head. A love would have granted her final wish. Love made it impossible to hasten her passing, no matter how merciful the intent. Eleanor's touch was warm, anchoring. The ethical burden was too great, the emotional cost too high. That's not weakness, it's human. The absolution in her words pierced a layer of guilt Mason had carried for 6 years. Not completely, not permanently, but enough to let him draw a deeper breath than he had in a long time. The dreams remind me, he said, of all I couldn't do. For her, for our son, for the soldiers who died under my care. The mind returns to unresolved pain, Eleanor observed, trying to find closure that may never come through memory alone. What's your prescription then, doctor? The question held no mockery, only genuine inquiry. Eleanor considered carefully. Not forgetting, not erasing, but perhaps counterbalancing, adding new experiences of healing, of success to weight against those of loss. You make it sound simple. It's not. It's perhaps the most difficult treatment of all. She withdrew her hand slowly. But isolation guarantees the balance never shifts. New memories cannot form in emptiness. The insight struck Mason with unexpected force. His retreat to the wilderness had frozen his grief in place, preserving it like an insect in amber, unchanged, undiminished by time or new experience. And your own ghosts, he asked, how do you balance them? By continuing the work, she answered simply. Each woman I help, each technique I improve weighs against those I couldn't save from Harrison's experiments. The parallel between their experiences created a bridge of understanding neither had anticipated. Both carried the burden of those they had failed to protect: Mason, his wife and patience, Eleanor, the women subjected to her fiancé's unethical practices. We should try to rest, Mason said finally. The storm will make tomorrow difficult. Eleanor nodded, rising from her place by the fire. Will you at least try to sleep properly, not just sitting watch until dawn? I'll try. The promise felt significant, a small concession to healing rather than mere endurance. She hesitated at the ladder, looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Good night, Mason. Good night, Eleanor. She ascended to the loft, leaving Mason with the unfamiliar warmth of his name on her lips and the lingering sensation of her hand on his. He settled onto his bedroll, expecting the usual resistance to sleep. Instead, exhaustion claimed him swiftly, pulling him into darkness, unplagued for once by dreams. The storm lasted 3 days, confining them to the cabin. Running Elk used the time to regain strength, practicing careful movements that tested his healing wound without straining it. By the third day, he announced his intention to return to his people. Storm ends tomorrow, he predicted, studying the quality of light through the snow-blurred window. My family searches, must return. Your wound needs more time, Mason cautioned. Running Elk smiled. Heals good. Shadow healer's medicine strong. He glanced between Mason and Eleanor. Two healers better than one. Mason didn't argue further. The Blackfoot warrior had recovered remarkably well, and his assessment of weather patterns had proven accurate in the past. If he believed the storm would break, it likely would. That evening, Running Elk shared stories of his people, legends of the mountains, tales of spirits, and ancestors that govern the natural world. Eleanor listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. Your medicine ways, Running Elk said to her when he finished, different from shadow healers. How so? Eleanor asked, curious about his perception. His medicine, the warrior made a chopping motion with his hand, direct cutting like knife. Your medicine, his gesture changed to a flowing movement, works within like river shaping stone. Different paths, same healing. Mason found the assessment surprisingly accurate. His surgical approach did tend toward intervention, decisive action. Eleanor's antiseptic protocols worked with the body's natural processes, creating conditions for healing rather than forcing it. All medicine should serve the patient, Eleanor said, whether through action or preparation. Running Elk nodded approval. Medicine woman understands balance. He turned to Mason. She helps your medicine too, makes stronger. The observation carried implications Mason wasn't prepared to examine. He deflected with practicality. We'll check your dressing once more before you leave. Make sure you have supplies for the journey. As predicted, morning brought clearing skies and diminishing winds. The storm had left another foot of snow, but sunshine promised eventual melting. Running Elk prepared for departure, accepting the medicines and bandages Eleanor packed for him. Return when needed, Mason said, clasping the warrior's arm in farewell. The cabin is open to you. Running Elk gripped his arm in return. Shadow healer finds his path again. Good medicine grows stronger. His dark eyes shifted to Eleanor. Medicine woman brings light to shadows. Eleanor smiled at the poetic assessment. Safe journey, Running Elk. May your wound continue healing cleanly. The Blackfoot warrior nodded, then turned to Mason with a final private message in his native tongue. The woman carries healing for your spirit as well as others. Do not turn away from this medicine. Before Mason could respond, Running Elk shouldered his pack and began the journey toward his people's winter camp. They watched until his figure disappeared among the pines, leaving them truly alone for the first time since Eleanor's arrival. An unexpected awkwardness descended. Without Running Elk as buffer, the cabin seemed smaller, their awareness of each other heightened. Mason busied himself with practical tasks, checking the wood supply, clearing snow from the path to the stable. Eleanor focused on organizing her salvaged belongings, creating a small work area on one side of the table where she could continue reviewing her journals. The domesticity of their parallel activities carried an intimacy neither acknowledged directly. By evening, they had established a new rhythm, a careful dance of shared space that maintained necessary distance while permitting practical cooperation. They prepared the evening meal together, moving around the cabin with growing familiarity. I've been thinking about your antiseptic protocols, Mason said as they ate. The applications extend beyond surgical practice. Eleanor looked up with interest. How so? Obstetrical cases particularly. Childbed fever claims too many lives, often due to physicians examining patients without proper hand cleansing between cases. Yes, Eleanor said eagerly. I included a section on obstetrical applications, though my opportunities to implement them were limited. Semmelweis demonstrated the connection between cadaveric contamination and puerperal fever decades ago, yet many physicians still resist his conclusions. Male physicians, Eleanor clarified, midwives have long observed that cleanliness improves outcomes. They simply lack the scientific framework to articulate why. Mason nodded, acknowledging the point. Your protocols bridge that gap, providing scientific rigor while honoring practical observation. That was my intent. Pleasure at his understanding brightened her features. Medicine advances best when it combines empirical evidence with respect for experience regardless of its source. Abigail would have agreed. The reference came naturally without the usual accompanying pain. She often said physicians would serve patients better, they listened more and lectured less. A wise woman. She was. Mason found himself smiling at the memory. Once a colleague visited our home to discuss a difficult case. He spent an hour explaining his diagnosis while Abigail served tea. When he finished, she politely suggested an alternative condition he hadn't considered, one that matched the symptoms perfectly. He was speechless. Eleanor laughed, the sound warming the cabin. Did he accept her diagnosis? Eventually, after presenting it as his own revelation to the medical society. Mason shook his head at the recollection. Abigail didn't mind. She said the patient's recovery mattered more than credit. She sounds remarkably like Elizabeth. Practical idealism, improving what can be changed while acknowledging what cannot. They continued sharing professional stories as they cleared the meal. Mason found himself recounting cases from his Army service without the usual accompanying guilt, focusing instead on innovations developed under pressure, lives saved against overwhelming odds. Eleanor described her work with Dr. Blackwell, the challenges and triumphs of practicing medicine in the narrow spaces allowed to women. Her stories revealed both frustration at artificial limitations and pride in accomplishments achieved despite them. As night deepened, they moved to seats before the fire, the conversation shifting to broader questions of medical ethics and philosophy. Mason found himself intellectually engaged in a way he hadn't experienced since leaving Chicago. Eleanor's mind was both rigorous and flexible, challenging his assumptions while respecting his expertise. I've missed this, he admitted during a pause in their discussion. Professional conversation, any conversation of substance. Mason stared into the flames. The isolation has served its purpose, but at a cost I hadn't fully calculated. The mind needs stimulation as much as the body needs nourishment, Eleanor observed. Starvation takes different forms. Yours must be particularly acute here. Boston to Montana is quite a cultural descent. I wouldn't call it descent. Transition, perhaps. She considered the question seriously. There's intellectual life here, too different in form, but not necessarily substance. The knowledge running elk carries, for instance, represents generations of observation and analysis. Most physicians would dismiss his understanding as primitive superstition. Most physicians are constrained by their training rather than expanded by it. Eleanor's eyes reflected firelight. True science requires openness to evidence from any source evaluated on merit rather than origin. The sentiment echoed Mason's own evolving perspective. His years among the Blackfoot had taught him respect for their medical traditions, their intimate knowledge of local plants and their properties. Combined with his formal training, this expanded understanding had saved lives, including his own, during a bout of fever his second winter. Your research, he said, returning to earlier thoughts, it deserves wider implementation. Have you considered next steps? Eleanor sighed. Constantly. But the practical barriers remain formidable. Harrison has connections throughout the Eastern medical establishment. Any attempt to publish under my name would be blocked. What about the West? San Francisco has several medical societies less beholden to Eastern influence. Perhaps. Hope and skepticism mingled in her expression. Though the journey remains challenging, especially now. The reference to her interrupted travel hung between them. The original plan reaching her aunt in San Francisco had receded in recent weeks, replaced by the immediate demands of survival and recovery. When the past clears, Mason said carefully, travel will be possible again. Eleanor studied him, something shifting in her gaze. Is that what you want, for me to continue to San Francisco? The direct question demanded equal directness in response. Mason found himself at a crossroads he hadn't anticipated when pulling Eleanor from the snow 3 weeks earlier. What I want has little relevance, he said finally. Your plans were made before our paths crossed. Plans change. Circumstances alter priorities. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. What if I were considering alternatives, such as remaining in Montana, perhaps establishing a practice in Cedar Ridge, or continuing research here where Harrison's influence doesn't reach? The possibility sent an unexpected current through Mason. Cedar Ridge is a mining town. Rough, unwelcoming to outsiders, especially women with unconventional aspirations. All frontiers are unwelcoming initially. That doesn't mean they remain so. Eleanor's gaze was steady. With proper introduction, proper sponsorship, barriers can be overcome. The implication was clear. Mason's standing in the region, limited though it was, could provide Eleanor the foothold she needed to establish herself professionally. "You would exchange Boston society for frontier hardship?" he asked, still uncertain of her meaning. "Based on 3 weeks' acquaintance with the territory." "I would exchange constraints for possibility," she corrected. "Based on evidence that my work might find fertile ground here, that I might practice medicine openly rather than in shadows." Mason studied her, trying to discern whether determination outweighed naivete in her assessment. Eleanor Reed possessed remarkable adaptability, but Montana winters broke stronger spirits than hers. The isolation that had been his refuge might become her prison. "The decision needn't be made tonight," he said, unwilling to either encourage or discourage her tentative proposal. "Spring is months away. The passes won't clear until then." Eleanor nodded, accepting the deferral without pressing further. "Of course, I merely wanted to raise the possibility, to gauge your reaction." "My reaction is—" Mason searched for words that neither misled nor revealed too much. "Surprise and concern that you might exchange one set of limitations for another without full understanding." "Fair enough." She rose from her seat, preparing to retire. "But consider this, Mason. I've spent my entire life navigating limitations. I've become rather skilled at recognizing which ones can be overcome and which cannot." With that, she ascended to the loft, leaving Mason with thoughts he couldn't easily dismiss. The possibility of Eleanor remaining in Montana, of her presence becoming more than temporary, stirred conflicting reactions he wasn't prepared to examine. He banked the fire for the night movement's automatic while his mind circled her suggestion. Cedar Ridge needed a physician, had needed one since old Doc Sanders died 2 years earlier. The mining operations produced regular injuries, and the growing families in the valley lacked proper medical care. A female doctor would face resistance initially, but Eleanor's skills would speak for themselves, particularly in obstetrical cases where women preferred female attendants. With proper introduction, as she had suggested, Mason stopped himself, recognizing the dangerous path his thoughts followed. He was planning engaging with a future that included Eleanor Reed's continued presence in his life. After 6 years of deliberate isolation, of emotional withdrawal, he was contemplating connection. The realization disturbed his carefully maintained equilibrium. Attachment meant vulnerability. Caring meant the possibility of loss. He had built his solitary existence precisely to avoid these risks. Yet as he settled onto his bedroll, Mason found himself unable to summon the usual resolve against human entanglement. Something had shifted during the weeks of Eleanor's presence, some frozen part of himself beginning to thaw, despite his determination to remain numb. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs, carrying the scent of snow and distant mountains. Inside, the cabin held the lingering warmth of shared conversation, of minds engaged in mutual exploration. The contrast between isolation and connection had never seemed so stark, nor the choice between them so consequential. Mason closed his eyes, knowing sleep would be elusive. Tomorrow would bring practical demands requiring full attention. The question of Eleanor's future and his own could wait for daylight. But in the darkness before dawn, when defenses weakened and truth emerged unbidden, Mason admitted what he had been avoiding for days. Eleanor Reed had awakened something he had thought permanently extinguished, not just the physician's calling, but the man's capacity for hope. The acknowledgement brought neither comfort nor resolution, only certainty that whatever path lay ahead, it could not return to what had been before. The frozen heart had begun to thaw, bringing both the promise of renewal and the pain that inevitably accompanied it. Days lengthened imperceptibly as January yielded to February. The rhythm of life in the cabin assumed a comfortable familiarity. Shared meals, divided chores, evenings spent in conversation or companionable silence. Mason continued hunting and trapping, maintaining their food supplies through the deepest part of winter. Eleanor organized her research, developing new applications for her antiseptic principles suited to frontier conditions. They established boundaries that preserved necessary privacy while acknowledging growing ease in each other's company. Mason found himself looking forward to evenings by the fire, to the intellectual stimulation of discussing medical advancements or debating philosophical questions. Eleanor proved an insightful partner in such conversations, her perspective shaped by different experiences, but equally rigorous in its foundations. She challenged Mason's assumptions without dismissing his expertise, expanding his thinking rather than merely contradicting it. In return, he shared knowledge gained through years of frontier medicine, practical adaptations of surgical techniques, uses of native plants, methods of improvising when standard supplies were unavailable. Eleanor absorbed these lessons eagerly, integrating them with her formal training. One clear February morning, Mason proposed a journey he had been considering for several days. "There's a place I'd like to show you," he said as they finished breakfast. "An hour's ride from here, if you feel strong enough for the excursion." Eleanor looked up with interest. "I'm fully recovered. What sort of place?" "A natural hot spring. The Blackfoot consider it sacred healing waters blessed by spirits. Scientifically, it contains minerals with therapeutic properties." "I'd like to see it," she said immediately. "When do we leave?" They set out mid-morning, Eleanor riding Thunder while Mason led the way on foot. The stallion had accepted Eleanor with surprising readiness, perhaps recognizing Mason's trust in her. She sat the horse with unexpected competence, revealing another skill her Boston upbringing had provided. The day was bright but cold, the snow-covered landscape glittering beneath cloudless blue sky. Their breath formed white plumes that dissipated in the still air. Mason set a moderate pace, choosing the easiest path through the snow-laden forest. "How did you discover the hot spring?" Eleanor asked as they traversed a small meadow. "My second winter here. I was caught in a blizzard while hunting, developed hypothermia." Mason remembered the disorientation, the dangerous lethargy that had nearly claimed his life. "Running Elk's father found me, brought me to the spring. The waters restored circulation, likely saved my limbs from frostbite. The Blackfoot have been uncommonly kind to you." "They recognize fellow outsiders," Mason said. "I don't pretend to understand their ways or impose mine on them. That earns a certain respect. And you provide medical care when needed. An equal exchange. They've taught me as much about healing as I've offered them." They continued through stands of pine and fir, the forest opening occasionally to reveal breathtaking vistas of mountains and valleys. Eleanor absorbed the scenery with evident appreciation, her eyes wide with wonder at particularly spectacular views. "It's overwhelming," she said during one such moment. "The scale of it all makes human concerns seem insignificant." "That's part of its appeal," Mason admitted. "Perspective. Is that what you sought here? Perspective on your loss?" "Initially, perhaps. Later, simply distance." He helped Thunder navigate a tricky descent. "The mountains don't ask questions or offer platitudes. They simply endure." Eleanor considered this. There's wisdom in that approach, though endurance alone seems an incomplete response to life. Before Mason could reply, they rounded a stand of pines and the hot spring came into view. Steam rose from a series of pools descending in natural terraces along a rocky slope. The water's mineral content had created striking formations, white rust and ochre deposits that rimmed each pool like nature's artwork. "It's beautiful," Eleanor breathed, taking in the scene. Mason helped her dismount, securing Thunder to a nearby tree. They approached the lowest pool where the water had cooled enough to permit comfortable immersion. Steam wreathed the surface, carrying the distinctive mineral scent that marked thermal waters. "The Blackfoot believe different pools heal different ailments," Mason explained. "Higher pools for spiritual wounds, lower for physical ones. The water flows between them, carrying medicine from the mountain's heart." Eleanor knelt beside the pool, trailing her fingers through the warm water. The temperature gradient would create different mineral concentrations, scientific basis for their categorization. "Yes, though I suspect their spiritual framework serves an equally important purpose in the healing process." She glanced up at him. "You've come to respect their approach." "I've come to recognize its effectiveness," Mason clarified. "Results matter more than explanations in practical medicine." Eleanor smiled, recognizing her own philosophy reflected back to her. "We find common ground again, Doctor." The observation carried warmth beyond the professional agreement it referenced. Mason felt the current between them strengthen an awareness that had been building during weeks of shared space and purpose. He moved slightly away, maintaining necessary distance. "We can rest here a while before returning. The pools are safe for bathing, though privacy is limited." "Another time, perhaps," Eleanor said, understanding his unstated concern. "For now, I'm content to appreciate the view." They settled on sun-warmed rocks beside the lowest pool, sharing the provisions Mason had packed for their journey. The setting invited contemplation, steam rising toward perfect blue sky, the distant panorama of mountains, the gentle sound of water flowing between pools. I've been thinking about Cedar Ridge, Eleanor said, after a comfortable silence, about establishing a practice there when spring comes. Mason had expected this conversation, eventually had rehearsed rational objections to her plan. Yet confronted with her calm determination, he found those objections weakening. The town has needed a physician since Doc Sanders died, he acknowledged, though they might resist a female doctor initially. Most communities do until the first crisis demonstrates skill matters more than gender. Eleanor's expression held practical assessment rather than naive optimism. With proper introduction, that resistance can be overcome more quickly. By proper introduction, you mean my endorsement. Your reputation carries weight in the region, despite or perhaps because of your reclusiveness. Mason considered the proposition. His standing in Cedar Ridge was complicated, respected for his occasional medical assistance during emergencies, regarded with suspicion for his solitary habits and friendship with the Blackfoot. My name might hinder as much as help, he said honestly. I'm something of an enigma to the townspeople. Enigmas intrigue rather than repel, Eleanor countered. Besides, your medical credentials remain impressive regardless of your current practice. The assumption that he would assist her plan revealed Eleanor's confidence not just in her own abilities, but in whatever connection had formed between them during their weeks together. You seem certain I'll support this endeavor, Mason observed. I'm certain you believe in proper medical care for those who need it. Eleanor met his gaze directly. Everything else is secondary. The appeal to professional ethics was skillfully done. Mason found himself responding to her vision despite lingering reservations. Cedar Ridge is growing, he conceded. The mining operations expand each year. New families arriving. They need more than emergency treatment when injuries occur. Precisely. Eleanor leaned forward, enthusiasm lighting her features. Preventative care, obstetrical services, ongoing treatment for chronic conditions, all currently unavailable without traveling to Billings. You've given this considerable thought. I've had little else to occupy my mind during recovery. She smiled slightly. Besides, planning suits my nature. I prefer direction to drift. Mason understood this quality in her, the need for purpose for forward movement. It contrasted with his own deliberate stasis these past 6 years, his retreat from engagement with future possibilities. And if Cedar Ridge proves unwelcoming despite all planning, he asked, what then? Then I adjust and try again. Perhaps another settlement or an itinerant practice serving multiple communities. Eleanor's determination was evident. The specifics matter less than the principle, using my training to provide care where it's needed. And your research, the antiseptic protocols. Implementation precedes publication. Results speak louder than theoretical papers. She gestured toward the mountains. This territory offers opportunity to demonstrate the protocol's effectiveness in challenging conditions, strengthening the case for their broader adoption. The clarity of her vision impressed Mason. Eleanor had transformed circumstance into opportunity, adapting her professional goals to new realities without abandoning their essence. You've found your path forward, he said, recognition rather than question. I believe so. Eleanor studied him with those perceptive green eyes. The question remains whether our paths might continue in parallel. The directness of her statement hung in the steam-laden air between them. Not quite a proposal, but more than a professional inquiry, an acknowledgement of the connection that had formed unexpected and unplanned during their shared winter isolation. Mason felt the weight of potential futures pressing against his carefully maintained present. Eleanor Reed offered not just professional collaboration, but personal possibility, a return to engagement with life after years of deliberate withdrawal. I've walked alone by choice, he said finally, for reasons that haven't fundamentally changed. Haven't they? Eleanor's question held no challenge, only genuine inquiry. You've treated running elk. You've shared medical knowledge. You've engaged with my research. These aren't the actions of a man who has abandoned his calling. Occasional assistance isn't the same as resuming practice. Perhaps not, but it suggests the capacity remains. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Mason, I'm not asking you to abandon the peace you've found here, only to consider that purpose and peace might coexist. The suggestion penetrated defenses Mason had maintained for years. Eleanor had seen what he had denied even to himself, that his retreat from medicine had never been complete, that the healer remained despite his efforts to subdue that aspect of himself. "I don't know if that's possible," he admitted. "Neither do I," Eleanor said softly. "But I believe it's worth discovering." The invitation in her words extended beyond professional collaboration to the personal current. Between them, the unacknowledged attraction, the growing emotional connection neither had planned. Mason found himself at a crossroads he had never expected to face again after Abigail's death. The path of continued isolation lay in one direction, familiar and safe in its emotional predictability. The other path, the one Eleanor illuminated, offered renewal, but also risked the vulnerability that came with caring with investment in outcomes beyond mere survival. Before he could respond, a sound from the forest edge drew his attention, a branch breaking under weight too substantial to be deer or elk. Mason rose immediately, signaling Eleanor to silence. His rifle lay within reach, a habit of frontier life he never abandoned. A figure emerged from the trees, tall, wrapped in a heavy coat that couldn't disguise a city cut of the clothing beneath. A man's face partially obscured by a trimmed beard, but carrying features that struck Mason with immediate recognition, despite never having seen them before. The stranger surveyed the scene, the hot springs thunder tied nearby Mason and Eleanor by the lowest pool with calculating assessment that suggested purpose rather than accidental discovery. "Dr. Reed," the man said, his cultured Boston accent incongruous in the wilderness setting, "I've been searching for you." Eleanor's face drained of color, recognition, and shock mingling in her expression. "Harrison." The name confirmed what Mason had already intuited. Dr. Harrison Wells, Eleanor's former fiancé, had found them. But he hadn't come alone. Another figure emerged from the trees behind him, a man whose resemblance to Mason was unmistakable, despite the years of separation. "Hello, little brother," William Thorne said, his voice carrying across the steaming pools. "It's been a long time." Time suspended as four figures faced each other across the steaming pools. Mason's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but he stopped short of grasping it. Violence in this sacred place seemed an abomination regardless of the threat these newcomers might pose. "Harrison," Eleanor repeated, her voice steadier now, despite the pallor of her face. "How did you find me?" Dr. Harrison Wells strode forward, ignoring Mason to focus entirely on Eleanor. He cut an impressive figure despite the journey that had brought him to this wilderness, tall, impeccably groomed, even after what must have been an arduous trek. His bearing suggested a man accustomed to deference, to having his will become reality through the simple expectation that it should. "Did you truly believe you could disappear?" Wells asked, his cultured voice carrying easily over the bubbling water. "Your father hired Pinkerton agents the moment he received your letter. They traced you to Chicago, then to the stagecoach line." "The accident," Eleanor said, understanding dawning. "Everyone was reported dead." "Yes, quite the complication." Wells removed his gloves with deliberate precision, until reports filtered back of a mountain hermit who had rescued a woman from the wreckage. "The description matched you remarkably well." Mason studied the man, recognizing the type from his Chicago days: wealthy, connected, accustomed to wielding influence like a scalpel. More dangerous than any armed assailant because his weapons were social rather than physical. "You've come a long way for nothing, Dr. Wells," Mason said deliberately, using the professional title as a shield between the men. "Miss Reed is free to make her own choices." Wells turned to Mason, really seeing him for the first time. His assessment was swift and dismissive. "And you are Dr. Mason Thorne," Eleanor answered before Mason could. "Former Union Army surgeon." Something flickered in Wells' eye, recognition, then calculation. "Thorne, yes, I know the name. Your reputation preceded you during the war." His gaze shifted to the other man. "As did your brothers." William Thorne stepped forward, the family resemblance to Mason unmistakable, despite the years and hardships that had reshaped both men. The same strong jawline, the same direct gaze. Though Williams held shadows Mason recognized too well: guilt, regret, the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. "Mason," William acknowledged. "You look, well, better than when you last saw me," Mason replied. Memories of their final encounter flooding back. Williams discussed his righteous condemnation, the severing of brotherhood in a tent filled with dying men. Eleanor moved closer to Mason, a gesture of solidarity that didn't escape Wells's notice. "Why is he with you?" she asked Wells, nodding toward William. "What possible connection?" "Professional association," Wells interrupted smoothly. Mr. Thorne has certain investigative skills that proved useful in locating you. His personal connection to Dr. Thorne was an unexpected benefit. The calculated way Wells revealed this information told Mason everything he needed to know about the man. He weaponized knowledge, deployed truth strategically for maximum impact. You hired my brother to find me, Mason said flatly. To find Eleanor, Wells corrected. Your involvement was unknown until recently. He smiled thinly. A remarkable coincidence, wouldn't you agree? Almost providential. William looked uncomfortable with the exchange, his eyes moving between Mason and Eleanor with something like apology. I didn't know you were here, Mason. Not until we reached Cedar Ridge and heard about the hermit physician. Yet you continued with him. Mason noted the betrayal fresh despite the years between them. I had my reasons. William's gaze hardened. Reasons you might understand better than most. The cryptic response hung in the air, another layer of complication in an already tangled situation. Mason sensed currents beneath the surface, motivations beyond the obvious that had brought these two unlikely companions to his sanctuary. Whatever your reasons, Eleanor said, gathering her composure, they're irrelevant. I'm not returning to Boston Harrison. That chapter of my life is closed. Wells sighed, the sound performative in its patience. Eleanor, you're not thinking clearly. The isolation, the trauma of the accident, they have affected your judgment. Your father is beside himself with worry. Your position at the hospital remains open. Everything can return to normal. Normal? Eleanor's laugh held no humor. You mean my silent complicity in your experiments? My research published under your name? A marriage that would render me your property under the law? She shook her head. I've found something better here. Better, Wells gestured dismissively at the wilderness around them. A primitive existence in the middle of nowhere, playing nurse to a disgraced surgeon hiding from his past. His voice hardened. Don't be absurd, Eleanor. You're coming home. Mason tensed at the proprietary tone, the assumption of authority over Eleanor's choices. Wells, I suggest you moderate your approach. Miss Reed has made her position clear. Has she? Wells turned his attention fully to Mason, assessment shifting to challenge. Or has she simply exchanged one man's influence for another's? Are you so different from me, Dr. Thorne, in recognizing her value, in wishing to claim it? The accusation struck uncomfortably close to truths Mason hadn't fully acknowledged. He had recognized Eleanor's worth, her intelligence, her skill, her resilience. Had he also unconsciously sought to keep those qualities in his orbit, to benefit from her presence, not just professionally, but personally? Before he could respond, William spoke again. Harrison, this isn't why we came. You promised. I know what I promised. Wells cut him off sharply. And I'll keep my word once Eleanor returns what she stole. I stole nothing, Eleanor countered. Those journals document my research as much as yours. More, in fact, since I conducted the actual observations while you were attending society functions. Semantics, Wells dismissed. The work was done under my supervision in my hospital with my patients. Legally and professionally, it belongs to me. Mason watched the exchange with growing certainty that Wells had not traveled thousands of miles merely to reclaim a fiancé or even valuable research. Something else drove this pursuit, something that involved William Thorne in ways not yet revealed. Why is my brother really here? Mason asked, interrupting the argument. What hold do you have over him? Wells smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. Perhaps you should ask him yourself. After all, family secrets should remain within the family, shouldn't they? William's expression tightened. Enough games, Harrison. Tell them the truth or I will. A tense silence followed, broken only by the bubbling of the hot springs. Wells studied William for a long moment, then shrugged with calculated nonchalance. Very well, if you insist on melodrama. He turned to face Mason directly. Your brother has been searching for you for 6 years, Dr. Thorne. Not out of fraternal affection, I assure you, but for a more personal reason. William believes you contributed to his wife's death, Eleanor said suddenly, comprehension dawning. Abigail was his sister, wasn't she? Mason felt the ground shift beneath him, past and present, colliding with devastating force. He looked at William, really seeing him now, the grief etched into his features, the anger barely contained beneath his controlled exterior. Abigail never told me she had a brother, Mason said, memories realigning to accommodate this new information. We were estranged. William admitted, pain evident beneath the words. Family disagreements. I was overseas when she met you, married you. By the time I returned to Chicago, she was already gone. The simple statement contained oceans of regret, of lost opportunity for reconciliation. Mason recognized the particular anguish of words left unspoken, relationships unrepaired, before death rendered such healing impossible. How did you connect with Dr. Wells? Eleanor asked, piecing together the unlikely alliance. William's gaze hardened as he looked at Wells. I traced Mason to Montana, but lost the trail. When I returned to Boston, I heard rumors about a physician whose experimental treatments had caused deaths similar to Abigail's. I wanted to understand what had happened to her. So you approached me under false pretenses. Wells concluded, seemingly unbothered by the deception. Offering investigative services while conducting your own inquiry. Quite resourceful. And what did you discover? Mason asked his brother, ignoring Wells to focus on the more pressing revelation. William hesitated, conflict evident in his expression. That Abigail's death wasn't simply bad luck or medical inevitability. That certain protocols might have saved her had they been implemented. Protocols that Harrison deliberately withheld, Eleanor said, understanding dawning. Because they were mine. Because implementing them would have meant acknowledging a woman's medical contribution. Wells laughed, the sound cold in the mountain air. What a convenient narrative you've constructed. The noble female physician, the vindictive male establishment. Reality is more complex, I assure you. Is it? Eleanor challenged. You refused to implement antiseptic procedures I developed because they contradicted your published positions. You dismissed evidence that they reduced infection rates because accepting it would have required admitting error. I rejected unproven techniques that contradicted established medical wisdom, Wells countered, as any responsible physician would. You rejected them until you could claim them as your own, Eleanor corrected. How many patients died while you waited for the right moment to appropriate my work? The accusation hung in the air, its implications expanding to include Abigail. Mason looked at his brother, seeing the terrible understanding in William's eyes. Abigail came to Wells when her fever started, William said quietly. Before coming to you, Mason, she sought a second opinion because she knew something was wrong. She never told me, Mason said, the revelation staggering him. She said she'd been feeling unwell for days, but not that she'd consulted another physician. She wouldn't have wanted to worry you, William replied. That was her way protecting others, even when she needed protection herself. Mason turned to Wells, pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. You examined her. What did you do? Wells straightened, professional defensiveness overtaking his earlier smugness. I performed a standard examination for puerperal fever. The presentation was typical: elevated temperature, abdominal tenderness, accelerated pulse. I prescribed the conventional treatments, which you knew were insufficient, Eleanor interjected. By then you had already seen my data on antiseptic procedures and their effectiveness in preventing childbed fever. Theoretical applications with limited testing. Wells dismissed. Mrs. Thorne's condition was already advanced. Even your experimental approaches would likely have failed. You didn't even try, William said, anger breaking through his controlled demeanor. You didn't tell her about alternative treatments. You didn't refer her to physicians who might have implemented them. Because she was Mason's wife, Eleanor realized, horror dawning. Because Mason was your professional rival in Chicago. Wells' expression confirmed the accusation without words. The calculation, the deliberate withholding of potentially life-saving information reflected a coldness that transcended mere professional jealousy. You let her die to punish me, Mason said, the words emerging as realization solidified into certainty. For what publishing techniques that challenged yours, taking patients who preferred my approaches? Don't be melodramatic, Wells scoffed. I followed accepted medical protocols for her condition. That they proved insufficient is unfortunate, but hardly criminal. It's unconscionable, Eleanor countered. You had evidence that alternative treatments might succeed where conventional ones failed. Your ethical obligation was to share that information regardless of personal feelings. The full weight of the revelation pressed against Mason's chest like a physical burden. For 6 years, he had carried guilt for failing to save Abigail, for being unable to halt the infection that claimed her life. Now he learned that another pathway might have existed, not certainty, but possibility. A chance denied by professional rivalry and personal animosity. "This is why you came with him," Mason said to his brother, understanding at last. "Not just to find me, but to confirm what you suspected about Abigail's treatment." William nodded, grief and anger mingling in his expression. "I needed to know if he deliberately withheld treatment that might have saved her. If her death was more than medical misfortune." "And now you know," Eleanor said softly. "Now we all know," Wells interjected, his composure returning. "Which changes nothing about our current situation. Eleanor, the journals contain research conducted under my authority. They must be returned. So you can continue claiming credit for work you didn't do." Eleanor shook her head. "Those journals document my observations, my protocols. They're rightfully mine." "The law would disagree," Wells said smoothly, "as would the medical society should this become a formal dispute." Mason watched the exchange, recognizing the threat beneath Wells's reasonable tone. The man wielded institutional power like a weapon, confident that structures designed to protect men like him would continue to do so regardless of ethical considerations. "There's another consideration," Wells continued, turning to Mason. "Your brother hasn't shared everything about his investigation. Have you, William?" William tensed, conflict evident in his expression. "Harrison, he discovered certain details about your wartime service." "Dr. Thorne," Wells continued, ignoring the interruption, "about the decisions you made during the Battle of Cold Harbor, the triage protocols you implemented without authorization." Mason felt blood drain from his face. The memories he had suppressed for years surfaced with terrible clarity: the overwhelmed field hospital, the hundreds of wounded beyond help, the choices he had made when medicines ran short and surgeons could not attend to all. Mason did what any physician would do in impossible circumstances, Eleanor said, moving to stand beside him. "Triage is standard practice in battlefield medicine." "Is it standard to administer lethal doses of morphine to the mortally wounded?" Wells asked with artificial innocence. "To decide which soldiers would receive treatment and which would receive mercy." The accusation hung in the air, its implications clear. What Mason had done during those desperate days, easing the suffering of men beyond medical help, hastening inevitable deaths to conserve resources for those who might survive, existed in a gray area between compassion and criminal act. "You've been investigating me as well," Mason said to his brother, betrayal fresh despite the years between them. "I needed to understand what happened to you after the war." William replied, genuine regret in his voice. "Why you disappeared, why you abandoned medicine. Harrison offered resources I couldn't access on my own. In exchange for helping him find Eleanor," Mason concluded. "And her research," Wells added. "Let's not pretend this is merely about a broken engagement. Those journals contain innovations that could transform surgical practice. Properly implemented, they represent considerable professional advancement. And financial opportunity," Eleanor added bitterly. "Patents, publications, speaking engagements, all bearing your name instead of mine." Wells didn't deny the accusation. "The medical establishment isn't ready for female attribution of significant innovations. Your work would be dismissed or ignored if presented under your name. Under mine, it will be implemented, saving countless lives." "At the cost of truth," Eleanor countered. "At the cost of your pride," Wells corrected. "A small sacrifice for the greater good." Mason had heard enough. The man's self-serving rationalizations disguised naked ambition as noble compromise. Wells would claim Eleanor's research as his own, while convincing himself he did her a favor by ensuring its implementation. "You're wrong," Mason said, voice quiet but firm. "About Eleanor's work, about what the medical community will accept, about everything that matters." Wells raised an eyebrow. "And you're the authority on current medical politics. A recluse who hasn't practiced in 6 years, who abandoned his profession rather than face the consequences of his wartime actions." "I know that truth matters," Mason replied. "That attribution matters. That stealing another's work violates the fundamental ethics of our profession, regardless of how you justify it. Noble sentiments from a man who played God in a field hospital." Wells said dismissively. "Your moral authority is somewhat compromised. Wouldn't you agree?" Before Mason could respond, William stepped forward. "Enough, Harrison. This isn't what we agreed to. We agreed to retrieve Eleanor and her research, Wells reminded him, by whatever means necessary. The implication hung in the air, transforming the confrontation from verbal to potentially physical. Mason assessed the situation rapidly. Wells wore no visible weapon, but William's coat could easily conceal a firearm. The terrain offered limited cover with the hot springs creating dangerous obstacles. Whatever you're planning, Mason said carefully, consider the consequences. We're miles from any settlement. Violence here would leave all parties vulnerable. I'm not suggesting violence, Wells replied smoothly. Merely resolution. Eleanor returns to Boston with me bringing her research. You and your brother sort out your family complications without my involvement. Everyone gets what they truly need. Except Eleanor, Mason pointed out, who has made her wishes clear. Eleanor doesn't know what she truly needs, Wells said with patronizing confidence. Isolation distorts perspective. A few weeks in the wilderness, and she imagines herself suited to frontier life. 3 months traveling west showed me more of life than years in Boston drawing rooms, Eleanor countered. I've made my choice, Harrison. I'm not returning with you. Wells' expression hardened, the mask of reasonableness slipping to reveal the determination beneath. You have no choice, Eleanor. Your father has signed commitment papers. If you don't return voluntarily, you'll be declared mentally incompetent and institutionalized. The threat landed with devastating force. Mason knew the reality behind such declarations: women committed for hysteria or nervous exhaustion when they defied family authority or social expectations. Once institutionalized, Eleanor would have no voice, no rights, no ability to defend her research or herself. You wouldn't, Eleanor whispered, her face pale with understanding. It's already done, Wells replied. The papers await only your father's final signature should you prove uncooperative. Mason had never struck another physician in his life. At that moment, watching Eleanor absorb this calculated cruelty, he came closer than ever before. Only William's warning look, a brother's silent communication transcending years of separation, kept him from action that would have escalated the confrontation beyond control. There's another option, William said, suddenly addressing Wells. One that satisfies your professional ambitions without destroying Eleanor's life. Wells turned to him with irritation. This doesn't concern you, Thorne. It concerns all of us, William persisted. You want the research recognized and implemented. Eleanor wants attribution. Both are possible through proper collaboration. The medical establishment is changing, William interrupted. Slowly, yes, but changing nonetheless. Female physicians practice in several major cities. Medical colleges for women exist in Philadelphia, New York, Chicago. Publication under joint attribution would be unusual but not unprecedented. Mason recognized his brother's strategy, appealing to Wells' ambition while offering a compromise that preserved Eleanor's dignity. It was skillfully done, evidence of the negotiating abilities that had made William successful in business before personal tragedy diverted his path. Joint attribution provides mutual protection, William continued. Eleanor's work gains your institutional authority. Your reputation benefits from innovative techniques that yield demonstrable results. Both parties advance professionally. Wells considered this calculation evident in his expression. An interesting proposal. Unfortunately, it fails to address the personal aspect of our arrangement. Eleanor and I are contracted to marry. Her father expects that contract to be honored. The contract was with Harrison Wells, respected physician, Eleanor said, finding her voice again. Not Harrison Wells, research thief and medical fraud. My father values his reputation above all else. How would he react to evidence of your experimental procedures, your falsified results, your threats against his daughter? The counterattack was precisely aimed. Wells' expression flickered with momentary uncertainty as he assessed this new calculation. You're bluffing, he said finally. You wouldn't destroy your father socially to escape our engagement. Wouldn't I? Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I fled across a continent, Harrison. I risked everything for freedom and professional integrity. Do you truly believe I'd hesitate to reveal the truth about you, whatever the consequences? Mason watched the silent battle of wills, admiring Eleanor's courage, even as he worried about the dangerous game she played. Wells was cornered, his careful plans disrupted by unexpected resistance. Cornered men were unpredictable, potentially violent when other options failed. William seemed to share this concern. He moved slightly, positioning himself where he could intercept Wells if the man made any sudden movement toward Eleanor. "There's another factor you haven't considered," Mason said, drawing Wells' attention away from Eleanor. "The journals themselves." "What about them?" Wells asked, irritation showing through his controlled facade. "They're not here," Mason said simply. "They're secured elsewhere with instructions for their disposition should anything happen to Eleanor or myself." The claim was false. The journals remained in the cabin, carefully stored among Eleanor's possessions. But Wells had no way to verify this, and the uncertainty introduced another variable into his calculations. "You're lying," Wells accused, though doubt had entered his expression. "Am I?" Mason held his gaze steadily. "Would you risk your professional future on that assumption?" The standoff continued, tension mounting as Wells assessed his dwindling options. Mason maintained his position, ready to move if the confrontation turned physical. Behind him, he sensed rather than saw Eleanor's steady presence, her resolve matching his own. The moment stretched, balanced on a knife's edge of possibility. Then unexpectedly, William laughed, a short, genuine sound that broke the tension like a stone shattering ice. "You always were a terrible poker player, Harrison," he said. "I can see you calculating odds you don't like." Wells' composure cracked slightly. "This isn't a game, Thorne." "Isn't it?" William countered. "You've played with lives and careers as if they were chips on a table. Now you're facing opponents who know your methods and have called your bluff." Something shifted in Wells' expression, resignation replacing calculation, acceptance replacing determination. Mason recognized the look of a man reassessing his position, preparing to retreat strategically rather than risk complete defeat. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion somewhere more civilized," Wells suggested, his tone deliberately reasonable. "The cabin, for instance, where we might examine the research together and discuss potential compromises." The apparent concession concealed purpose Mason didn't yet understand. Wells hadn't abandoned his objectives, merely altered his approach. Something in the man's demeanor, a subtle tension, a watchfulness, suggested he held resources still undeployed. "The cabin is an hour's ride from here," Mason said carefully, "and these springs are sacred to the Blackfoot. We should respect their traditions by leaving them as we found them." The statement served dual purpose, reminding Wells they were in territory where different rules applied and allowing Mason to redirect the confrontation away from this vulnerable location. Of course, Wells agreed too readily. Native sensibilities must be respected, however primitive their beliefs. "Shall we proceed? Then I'm most interested to see your accommodations." The slight emphasis on the final word carried unmistakable condescension. Wells viewed Mason's life choices as incomprehensible regression, a physician of training and talent, reduced to wilderness existence. What he failed to understand was that Mason had chosen this path deliberately, finding in isolation the peace that had eluded him in civilization. "I'll return thunder to the cabin," Mason said to Eleanor. "Can you manage the walk with our guests?" Eleanor nodded in understanding the unspoken communication. Mason needed to reach the cabin first to secure the journals before Wells could access them. Their strategy of misdirection required this preparation. "We'll follow the lower trail," she agreed. "It's easier walking, though slightly longer." Wells seemed about to object, then reconsidered. "As you wish, though I confess some concern about your health after your recent ordeal, Eleanor. Perhaps Mr. Thorne could accompany you while Dr. Thorne tends to his horse." The suggestion held subtle menace, separating Eleanor from Mason, placing her with William, whose loyalties remained uncertain. Mason hesitated, reluctant to leave her vulnerable, yet needing to secure the cabin before their arrival. "I'm fully recovered," Eleanor said firmly, "and quite capable of managing a familiar trail. Dr. Wells's concern, while appreciated, is unnecessary." The slight emphasis on Wells's title reclaimed professional distance, rejecting the personal authority he had assumed. It was skillfully done, asserting independence without direct confrontation. "As you wish," Wells conceded with forced graciousness, "though I must insist we remain together. These mountains harbor dangers a city-bred woman might not recognize." "Eleanor has adapted remarkably well to frontier life," Mason said, pride evident beneath his neutral tone. "You might be surprised by her capabilities." The subtle claim of intimacy, of knowing Eleanor in ways Wells did not register in the physician's expression. Possessiveness flashed briefly before control reasserted itself. I look forward to observing these adaptations, Wells replied smoothly. Shall we proceed? Mason untied Thunder mounting with practiced ease. He fixed his brother with a direct gaze, searching for some indication of William's true position in this complex situation. We have much to discuss, he said simply. William nodded acknowledgement and perhaps apology in the gesture. Yes, we do. Mason urged Thunder forward, setting a pace that would bring him to the cabin well before the walking party. As he rode, his mind worked rapidly, assessing options and potential outcomes. Wells had not traveled this distance merely to accept defeat. The man's reputation for persistence matched his professional accomplishments. He would have contingency plans, resources not yet revealed. The apparent concession likely concealed strategy rather than surrender. Reaching the cabin, Mason dismounted and quickly tended to Thunder's needs. Inside, he moved with purposeful efficiency, gathering Eleanor's journals and securing them beneath a loose floorboard he had installed years earlier for valuables. The hiding place wasn't sophisticated, but it would prevent immediate discovery. Next, he checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded and accessible without being obviously prepared for confrontation. Violence remained a last resort, but Mason had survived wilderness living long enough to recognize that preparation often prevented necessity. Finally, he built up the fire and prepared coffee, the basic hospitality that frontier etiquette demanded even for unwelcome guests. The familiar task helped order his thoughts, calm the emotions that threatened to overwhelm rational assessment. William alive, William here. The brother he had believed lost to him through unforgivable differences, through mutual recrimination over choices made in war's moral crucible. The brother who was also Abigail's brother, carrying grief and anger Mason recognized too intimately. And Wells, a physician whose ambition had corrupted healing into self-advancement, whose actions had contributed to Abigail's death through deliberate withholding of potentially life-saving treatment. The implications staggered Mason, rearranging 6 years of guilt and self-recrimination into new patterns that demanded reassessment. Most immediate, though, was concern for Eleanor. Wells's threat of institutionalization represented genuine danger. Such declarations of mental incompetence were difficult to challenge once implemented, particularly for women whose property and legal rights transferred to male guardians upon commitment. Eleanor's independence, her professional future, her very freedom hung in the balance of decisions made in the next hours. Mason found himself unwilling to contemplate her return to Boston under Wells's control, not just for the research that would be stolen, but for the spirit that would be broken. When had her welfare become so essential to his own peace? The questions surfaced unbidden, demanding acknowledgement he had avoided during their weeks together. Eleanor Reed had breached defenses, built over years of isolation, awakening not just the physician, but the man. The realization both comforted and terrified. Voices outside announced the group's arrival. Mason composed himself, preparing for confrontation that would determine multiple futures. Eleanor entered first, her expression communicating silent questions. He answered with a slight nod. The journals were secure. She relaxed marginally, moving to stand near the fire in a position that placed Mason between her and Wells. William followed his gaze, taking in the cabin's sparse but functional appointments. Recognition flickered in his eyes, elements of the home Mason and Abigail had shared in Chicago preserved here in the wilderness. The family Bible on the shelf, the hand-carved chess set in the corner, small continuities that connected past to present despite deliberate severance. Wells entered last, surveying the cabin with poorly disguised disdain. His assessment categorized and dismissed primitive accommodations, limited resources, isolation from everything he valued in civilization. Rustic, he commented, removing his gloves with deliberate precision, though I suppose adequate for basic survival. It serves its purpose, Mason replied neutrally, pouring coffee into tin cups. As does civilization for those who prefer it. More than preference, surely, Jen, Wells said, accepting the coffee with a nod that acknowledged the hospitality without expressing gratitude. Civilization represents progress, advancement. Retreat to wilderness represents what exactly? Rejection of human achievement, romantic primitivism. Perhaps recognition that progress contains both benefits and cost. Eleanor suggested, warming her hands around her cup. That advancement sometimes requires reassessment of what truly matters. Wells smiled thinly. Philosophical justifications for what remains fundamentally regression. But we didn't come to debate the merits of frontier living. He set down his cup untasted. We came to resolve our situation practically. Our situation, Eleanor repeated. You mean your attempt to reclaim what was never rightfully yours? I mean finding resolution that serves all parties' interest, Wells corrected smoothly. Your research implemented where it can save lives. Your future secured in a position commensurate with your abilities. My own professional standing maintained. Mutually beneficial outcomes. At what cost, Mason asked. Eleanor's independence, her rightful attribution, her freedom to choose her own path. Sentimental considerations that ignore practical realities. Wells dismissed. A woman physician faces barriers no amount of frontier romanticism can eliminate. Eleanor's research will languish unpublished or be dismissed if presented under her name alone. These are facts, not prejudices, I personally endorse. The argument held enough truth to be dangerous. The medical establishment did resist female contributions, did dismiss research from women regardless of merit. Wells offered the compromise many female physicians accepted male sponsorship in exchange for diminished recognition. There are alternatives, William interjected, surprising all of them. Joint publication, collaborative practice, female medical colleges seeking faculty with Eleanor's qualifications. Wells turned to him with evident irritation. Fringe institutions with limited influence. Hardly comparable to the opportunities I offer. Opportunities that come with golden chains, Eleanor said quietly. Attribution with asterisks. Recognition with reservations. Freedom with conditions. Reality contains constraints, Wells countered. True freedom lies in navigating them skillfully, not pretending they don't exist. Mason watched the exchange, recognizing the dangerous appeal of Wells's pragmatism. His arguments reflected institutional realities Eleanor would face regardless of location or circumstances. The medical establishment's resistance to female physicians transcended geography, persisting in Montana as surely as in Boston. You speak of constraints as if they're natural law rather than human construction, Mason observed. Barriers can be dismantled as surely as they were built. By whom, Wells challenged? Idealists hiding in the wilderness. Women without institutional authority. Change requires power, Dr. Thorne. Power Eleanor might access through our association but cannot claim independently. You mistake adaptation for surrender. Eleanor responded, her voice steady despite the weight of truths embedded in Wells's argument. I've never expected barriers to disappear, only that they can be circumvented, undermined, or transformed through persistent effort. Admirable sentiments, Wells said with patronizing approval. But sentiment doesn't publish research or implement protocols or save lives. Practical compromise does. The conversation had reached circular impasse, principles against pragmatism, idealism against institutional reality. Mason recognized Wells' strategy, wearing down resistance through relentless emphasis on practical constraints until compromise seemed the only rational choice. Enough rhetoric, Mason said, cutting through the cycle. What exactly are you proposing, Wells, in concrete terms, not philosophical abstractions? Wells nodded, apparently pleased to move towards specifics. Joint attribution on the antiseptic protocols. Publications in leading medical journals under both our names with Eleanor recognized as primary researcher. A position for her at Massachusetts General with genuine responsibility rather than mere honorary title. The offer exceeded what most female physicians could hope for: professional recognition. Institutional position, published attribution. It represented compromise from Wells's original intention to claim Eleanor's work entirely as his own. And in exchange, Mason prompted, recognizing the proposal remained incomplete. Eleanor returns to Boston, honors her engagement, maintains appropriate public discretion regarding philosophical differences between us. Wells' expression remained neutral, but his meaning was clear. Eleanor would present the united front expected of a physician's wife, regardless of private disagreements. You want not just my research, but my silence, Eleanor concluded. My complicity in whatever treatments you implement, whatever patients you experiment upon. I want professional partnership with personal loyalty, Wells corrected, expectations any husband might reasonably hold. Except most husbands don't threaten institutionalization when loyalty falters, Mason pointed out. Wells sighed to sound deliberately patient. A regrettable leverage point I hope never to employ. But Eleanor's father remains convinced her flight represents nervous collapse rather than rational choice. His concern provides certain options should compromise prove impossible. The threat remained thinly veiled beneath reasonable tone. Wells believed his position unassailable, institutional authority, legal structures, and social expectations aligned to support his claims over Eleanor's resistance. William had remained silent during this exchange, his expression troubled as he followed the maneuvering. Now he spoke, addressing Wells directly. "There's another factor you haven't considered," he said quietly. "One that might alter your calculations considerably." Wells turned to him with evident annoyance. "What now, Thorne?" "The journals contain more than antiseptic protocols," William said. "They document your experimental procedures, the treatments administered without consent, the patients who died while you tested techniques without safeguards." Mason watched his brother closely, recognizing the gambit. William was playing his strongest card, the potential exposure Wells feared more than professional setback or lost research. "Eleanor's careful documentation includes dates, names, procedures," William continued, "information that would interest not just the medical society, but legal authorities." Wells's composure slipped momentarily before control reasserted itself. "Allegations without witnesses. The word of a woman deemed mentally unstable by her own father. Hardly compelling evidence." "Except I've identified 3 surviving patients," William countered. "Women willing to testify about treatments they received without understanding or consent. Their statements are already documented, held by my attorney in Boston, should anything unfortunate occur." The claim shifted power dynamics instantly. Wells' expression hardened calculation, replacing confidence as he reassessed his position. "You've overstepped your role, Thorne," he said coldly. "Our arrangement concerned locating Eleanor, not conducting independent investigation." "I've always conducted independent investigation," William replied evenly. "You simply assumed our objectives align completely. They don't." Mason felt grudging admiration for his brother's strategy. William had used Wells' resources to pursue his own agenda by understanding Abigail's death while gathering leverage against the man he suspected of contributing to it. "This changes nothing," Wells insisted, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Allegations can be countered, witnesses discredited, the journals themselves secured." "At what cost?" William asked, echoing Mason's earlier question. "Your reputation, your practice, your freedom, should criminal charges result." The threat hung in the air, potent and undeniable. Wells' entire strategy depended on institutional protection, the medical establishment closing ranks around one of its own. That protection might withstand professional disputes, but would crumble against criminal allegations, and particularly those involving female patients. "You're bluffing," Wells said finally, though uncertainty had entered his voice. "Am I?" William held his gaze steadily. "Are you willing to risk everything on that assumption?" The cabin fell silent as Wells calculated his dwindling options. Mason watched the internal struggle play across the physician's features. Ambition against self-preservation, determination against pragmatic retreat. "Perhaps," Wells said carefully, "we've approached this situation too adversarially. All parties desire similar outcomes: medical advancement, professional recognition, appropriate attribution. Perhaps a more collaborative solution exists." The concession, while strategic rather than sincere, represented the first genuine shift in Wells's position. He had recognized his vulnerability, adjusted accordingly. "What sort of collaboration?" Eleanor asked cautiously. "Independent publication," Wells suggested. "You in the West documenting implementation of your protocols in frontier conditions. I in the East at adapting them for urban hospital settings. Parallel research strengthening the case for broader adoption." The proposal offered Eleanor freedom while preserving Wells' professional standing, a compromise born of necessity rather than conviction, but practical nonetheless. "And the engagement," Mason pressed, unwilling to leave this crucial point unaddressed. Wells glanced between Mason and Eleanor, reading the unspoken connection with evident displeasure. Clearly, circumstances have changed. I release Eleanor from our arrangement with the understanding that our professional collaboration remains separate from personal circumstances. The concession cost him visibly not from lost affection, but from wounded pride. Wells had come to reclaim what he considered his property, both intellectual and personal. Retreating with only half his objective accomplished represented significant defeat. "And my father," Eleanor asked, "the commitment papers. I will personally assure him of your mental stability and professional opportunities in the West," Wells promised. "His primary concern is your welfare, not your specific location." Mason doubted the sincerity of this assurance, but recognized it as the best available under current circumstances. Wells needed Eleanor's cooperation regarding the research. Threatening her freedom would undermine that necessity. "One final condition," Eleanor said, her voice firm, "the women you experimented upon. They receive proper care and compensation for any lasting effects of your treatments." Wells stiffened, professional pride warring with practical necessity. "That would constitute admission of impropriety." "It constitutes basic medical ethics," Eleanor countered. "Responsibility for patient welfare regardless of circumstances." The demand placed Wells in difficult position, accepting accountability he had evaded throughout his career. Mason watched the internal calculation, the weighing of reputation against potential consequences. "I will ensure they receive appropriate care," Wells conceded finally. "Discreetly through hospital charity funds rather than personal compensation, which might suggest culpability." The compromise was imperfect, but represented more than Wells would have offered without leverage. Eleanor glanced at William, who nodded slightly, acceptance of a partial victory where complete justice remained impossible. "Then we have agreement," Eleanor said. "I retain my journals and research. I publish independently from the West. You adapt protocols for Eastern implementation with appropriate attribution. The engagement ends without further threat of institutional commitment." Wells nodded stiffly, his expression suggesting temporary retreat rather than permanent acceptance. "Conditional upon verification that all journal copies remain in your possession rather than distributed to other parties." The qualification revealed continued concern about exposure, fear that Eleanor had already shared documented evidence of his experimental procedures with others who might use it without William's restraining influence. "The journals remain complete," Eleanor assured him. "I had no opportunity to duplicate them before leaving Boston." Relief flickered across Wells's features before control reasserted itself. "Then our business is concluded. I'll depart for Cedar Ridge tomorrow and continue east by stagecoach." "I'll accompany you to town," William said, the statement directed more to Mason than Wells. "We have matters still unsettled between us." The simple acknowledgement of unfinished business between brothers carried weight beyond its literal meaning. William was offering opportunity for reconciliation, for addressing the breach that had separated them for 15 years. "Yes," Mason agreed quietly. "We do." Wells glanced between them with barely concealed impatience. Charming as this family reunion may be, practical considerations remain. Nightfall approaches. The journey to Cedar Ridge requires daylight. "You'll stay here tonight," Mason said, making the offer frontier hospitality demanded, despite personal preference. "Leave at first light tomorrow." Wells looked around the cabin with poorly disguised distaste. "Your accommodations seem limited." "You're welcome to sleep in the stable with Thunder," Mason suggested. "The hay is fresh." William suppressed a smile at the pointed offer. "The cabin will suffice, Harrison. One night of discomfort won't kill you." Indeed. Wells removed his coat with resigned acceptance. "Though I confess some curiosity about sleeping arrangements generally. The cabin appears designed for a single occupant, yet has housed two for some weeks now." The implication was deliberate, questioning Eleanor's propriety and Mason's intentions simultaneously. Before Mason could respond, Eleanor spoke with calm dignity. "Dr. Thorne has shown nothing but respect and consideration during my recovery," she said firmly, "including sleeping on the floor while I occupied the loft. Your insinuation reflects poorly on your understanding of either of us." The rebuke, delivered with quiet authority, silenced further comment from Wells. He nodded stiffly, accepting correction he clearly resented. "Of course, I meant no offense." The evening proceeded with strained courtesy, meal preparation, conversation limited to neutral topics, careful maintenance of personal space within the cabin's confined quarters. Mason observed Wells throughout, noting the physician's continued calculation beneath superficial compliance. The man had conceded temporarily but not surrendered his objectives. Given opportunity, he would still attempt to secure Eleanor's research without the compromises circumstances had forced upon him. His retreat was strategic rather than principled, a repositioning rather than reconciliation. As darkness settled outside, sleeping arrangements were established. Eleanor in the loft as usual, Mason and William on bedrolls near the fire, Wells on a pallet Mason constructed from spare blankets. The configuration maintained necessary separation while acknowledging limited options. Mason found sleep elusive despite physical exhaustion. Too many revelations, too many shifted realities demanded processing. William alive and present after years of separation. Abigail's death connected to Wells's professional jealousy and ethical failures. Eleanor's future hanging in uncertain balance between freedom and constraint. And beneath these external circumstances, internal recognition he could no longer deny. Eleanor had become essential to his peace in ways that transcended professional respect or practical collaboration. The prospect of her departure, whether to Boston under Wells' influence or independently to San Francisco, created hollowness he hadn't expected to feel again after Abigail's death. When had isolation transformed from refuge to prison? When had solitude become loneliness rather than protection? The questions circled without resolution as Mason drifted finally into uneasy sleep. He woke instantly, alert, years of wilderness living, having honed reflexes that registered disturbance before conscious awareness. The cabin was dark, the fire burned to embers that cast minimal glow. Something had changed, some alteration in the night's rhythm had triggered warning. Mason remained motionless, his senses cataloging information. William's steady breathing from the nearby bedroll, the wind's low moan outside the cabin walls, the creaking of timber contracting in night cold. What was missing? Wells. The pallet where the physician had settled hours earlier lay empty, blankets thrown aside with apparent haste. Mason rose silently, years of hunting having taught soundless movement even in darkness. He checked the door, still barred from inside, eliminating the possibility that Wells had simply stepped out momentarily. A soft sound from the loft turned his attention upward. Moving with careful precision, Mason approached the ladder, listening intently. The sound came again, fabric rustling, followed by whispered words too low to distinguish. Mason ascended slowly, each rung tested before weight transferred to prevent creaking that might alert the occupants above. As his head cleared the loft floor, the scene became visible in the faint moonlight, filtering through the cabin's single window. Wells stood beside the sleeping platform where Eleanor lay apparently unconscious, her breathing deep and regular, in a pattern Mason recognized with sudden alarm. The physician bent over her, one hand searching through the bedding, while the other held a small vial Mason identified immediately from professional experience. Chloroform. Wells had drugged Eleanor into unconsciousness while the cabin slept, and now searched for the journals he believed hidden among her personal possessions. Rage surged through Mason, not the controllable anger of professional disagreement, but primal fury at violation of trust, at predatory action against someone vulnerable. He completed his ascent in a single fluid movement that caught Wells entirely by surprise. "Step away from her," Mason ordered, voice low but carrying unmistakable threat. Wells straightened the vial, disappearing into his pocket with practiced sleight of hand. "Dr. Thorne, I was just checking on Eleanor. She seemed restless earlier." With chloroform. Mason moved forward, positioning himself between Wells and Eleanor's unconscious form. "Step away." Recognition that his deception had failed transformed Wells' expression from false concern to cold calculation. "She'll wake naturally in an hour or so. No lasting effects. I simply needed to confirm the journal's location without interference." By drugging a sleeping woman, Mason's control threatened to break entirely. "Have you abandoned even the pretense of medical ethics?" "Ethics are luxuries, Dr. Thorne," Wells replied, his voice hardening. "Survival requires pragmatism. Those journals represent my professional future. I cannot leave them in Eleanor's unreliable hands." "They were never yours to claim," Mason countered. "Leave the cabin now while you still can, under your own power." The threat registered in Wells' expression, quickly replaced by assessment of relative advantage. The physician was younger, perhaps stronger, but Mason had survived wilderness living that broke lesser men. The calculation was brief but comprehensive. "This isn't finished," Wells said, backing toward the ladder. Eleanor will never succeed independently. She'll return to Boston eventually under less favorable terms than I've offered tonight. She'll never be under your control again, Mason replied with absolute certainty. Whatever future she chooses. Wells descended the ladder with dignity that belied his thwarted purpose. Mason followed, unwilling to leave Eleanor unprotected despite the apparent retreat. At the bottom he found William awake and watchful, alerted by their voices despite their low volume. Harrison, William questioned, taking in the tense tableau. Our colleague attempted to secure the journals through less than ethical means. Mason explained, his gaze never leaving Wells. Chloroform administered while Eleanor slept. William's expression hardened with disgust. Have you lost your mind, Harrison? Drugging a woman in her sleep, searching her belongings like a common thief. Spare me your moral indignation, Wells snapped. You've manipulated this situation from the beginning, Thorne, using me to find your brother while building a case against me regarding your sister's treatment. I followed evidence where it led, William replied coldly, just as you followed ambition regardless of ethical boundaries. The confrontation might have escalated further had not a sound from outside frozen all three men in momentary stillness. Horses approaching, multiple riders moving with purpose rather than caution. Expecting company, Dr. Thorne, Wells asked, calculation replacing anger in his expression. Mason moved to the window, peering through frost-edged glass into moonlit darkness. Three riders approached the cabin, their silhouettes unmistakable against snow-covered ground. Not random travelers, but men with purpose, arriving at this isolated location in pre-dawn darkness. Your insurance policy, Mason asked Wells, recognizing orchestration rather than coincidence. Wells smiled thinly. Contingency planning. 3 associates who accompanied us from Cedar Ridge prepared to assist should negotiation prove insufficient. Hired guns, William translated flatly. You never intended honest compromise. I intended resolution by whatever means necessary, Wells corrected. The journals will return to Boston with me. Eleanor as well, should she prove amenable to reconsideration. If not, he shrugged eloquently. Her father's commitment papers await. The casual cruelty of the statement, the calculated deployment of resources to overwhelm resistance, revealed Wells's true character more clearly than any previous interaction. This was a man for whom objectives justified any method, for whom others existed as instruments rather than individuals. You're not taking her anywhere, Mason said, the statement simple fact rather than threat. Wells glanced toward the window where approaching riders now dismounted. 3 armed men suggest otherwise, Dr. Thorne. I admire your frontier resilience, but practical assessment indicates your position is untenable. Mason moved to the rifle mounted above the door, the motion deliberate rather than hurried. You've miscalculated, Wells. This isn't Boston with its social constraints and legal manipulations. This is Montana territory. Different rules apply. Rules enforced by whoever holds superior force, Wells observed, confidence returning as his reinforcements approached. A lesson from your army service you seem to have forgotten. A knock at the door, 3 sharp raps followed by 2 softer ones. Clearly a predetermined signal confirming the arrival's identity. Wells smiled, satisfaction evident in his expression. Your move, Dr. Thorne. Mason assessed options rapidly, professional detachment, separating emotion from strategic necessity. 3 armed men outside. Wells and potentially William inside. Eleanor unconscious and vulnerable in the loft. Limited cover within the cabin's single room. Before he could respond, another voice entered the calculation. Running Elk's distinctive pattern of movement on the cabin roof, recognized from previous visits when the Blackfoot warrior preferred to announce his presence from above rather than approach the door directly. Mason suppressed visible reaction to this unexpected advantage. Running Elk had returned, perhaps to check on his healing or to deliver message from his people. Whatever the reason, his presence altered the balance of power in ways Wells couldn't anticipate. Open the door, William, Mason directed, decision made. Let's address this situation directly. William hesitated, clearly questioning the wisdom of facing armed men without preparation. Nevertheless, he moved to the door, removing the bar that secured it against outside entry. The door swung open to reveal 3 men bundled against mountain cold, their expressions professional rather than personal. Hired hands rather than committed allies, men doing a job for payment, not ideological commitment. Dr. Wells, the foremost, acknowledged with a nod. We heard negotiation might require reinforcement. Indeed. Wells moved forward with renewed confidence. Dr. Thorne proves reluctant to honor our agreement regarding Eleanor's return to Boston. Perhaps you gentlemen might help him reconsider. Mason held his position rifle held non-threateningly but visibly. I suggest you consider your next actions carefully. This territory handles justice differently than eastern cities. The lead gunman assessed Mason with experienced eyes, recognizing capability beneath the physician's exterior. No need for complications, Doc. The lady and some papers go back east. Nobody gets hurt. Simple business. The lady isn't property to be transported against her will, Mason replied evenly. Nor are her professional works subject to appropriation by others. Wells sighed with theatrical patience. We've had this discussion, Dr. Thorne. Ethics versus practicality. The inevitable conclusion remains unchanged regardless of your philosophical objections. Before Mason could respond, movement on the roof drew everyone's attention. Running Elk dropped into view outside the door, bow drawn and arrow aimed with unwavering precision at the lead gunman's chest. 3 white men, the Blackfoot warrior observed calmly. 3 arrows, no missing at this distance. The gunman froze, recognizing the deadly mathematics of their situation. Firearms required drawing, aiming, firing actions. Running Elk's already drawn bow would proceed with fatal consequence for at least one of their number. This doesn't concern you, Indian, the lead gunman said, tension evident beneath false bravado. Shadow Healer saved my life, Running Elk replied simply. Medicine Woman helped. Their enemies are my enemies. The simple loyalty of the statement contrasted sharply with Wells's calculated alliances and conditional arrangements. Running Elk offered his protection not from complex negotiation, but from fundamental gratitude. Life saved, deserved life risked in return. Harrison, William said quietly, this has gone too far. No research is worth bloodshed. Wells' expression revealed internal struggle, ambition against self-preservation, objectives against practical assessment of deteriorating position. Finally, calculation prevailed over determination. Stand down, he instructed the gunman. The situation has evolved beyond initial parameters. The hired men exchanged glances, clearly relieved to avoid confrontation with Running Elk's unwavering aim. They stepped back from the doorway, weapons remaining holstered in tacit acceptance of stalemate. A wise decision, Mason acknowledged. Now I suggest you all depart. The journals remain with Eleanor. Her future remains her choice. These terms are non-negotiable. Wells studied him with cold assessment, recognizing defeat but not accepting its permanence. This isn't finished, Thorne. Boston has longer reach than you imagine, even in this wilderness. Perhaps, Mason conceded, but that reach doesn't extend to this cabin tonight, or to Eleanor's freedom of choice tomorrow. The simple declaration established boundaries Wells couldn't presently overcome. The physician nodded stiffly, acknowledging tactical retreat while clearly preserving strategic intentions. We'll depart at first light, he said, reclaiming dignity through formal courtesy. I trust our mounts will remain undisturbed until then. They're safe in the lean-to, Mason confirmed, provided your men maintain current positions until morning. The conditional assurance was understood by all parties. Peace held only through mutual adherence to temporary truce. Running Elk maintained his aim, reinforcing this understanding without words. We'll camp by the creek, the lead gunman decided, professional assessment, recognizing untenable position. No trouble from us before dawn. William closed the door as the men retreated, securing the bar with evident relief. That was closer than comfortable, he observed. Wells never intended honest negotiation, Mason said, setting aside his rifle now that immediate threat had passed. The compromise was temporary measure until superior force arrived. Running Elk entered through the rear window, his customary access when visiting during Mason's absence. Shadow Healer called by spirits, he explained, seeing Mason's questioning look. Dream vision, medicine woman in danger. The simple explanation reflected Blackfoot's spiritual framework rather than coincidence or luck. Mason accepted it with grateful nod, regardless of underlying mechanism. Your arrival was well-timed, he acknowledged. Wells drugged Eleanor and searched for her journals while we slept. Running Elk's expression darkened with understanding. Bad medicine, man with snake heart. An accurate diagnosis, William agreed, though I bear some responsibility for bringing him here. You couldn't have known his intentions, Mason said, finding forgiveness easier than expected after years of estrangement. Wells manipulated everyone around him, colleagues, patients, even his own fiancée. I should have recognized his character sooner, William insisted. The signs were there in his professional reputation, in comments from colleagues who feared rather than respected him. The self-recrimination reflected genuine regret rather than performative guilt. Mason recognized the burden his brother carried, not just regarding Wells, but concerning their own broken relationship, Abigail's death, years of separation that could never be reclaimed. What matters now is protecting Eleanor until Wells departs, Mason said, focusing on immediate concerns rather than past regrets, and ensuring he truly leaves rather than establishing new strategy. I'll ride with him to Cedar Ridge, William offered. Ensure he boards the eastbound stage. My associates in Boston will monitor his activities. They'll prevent implementation of threats regarding Eleanor's father or professional standing. The practical assistance reflected William's skills, business connections, strategic thinking resources beyond Mason's wilderness existence. Perhaps their differences complemented rather than conflicted, each brother offering strengths the other lacked. Medicine woman sleep until sun, Running Elk observed, glancing toward the loft. White man sleeping medicine strong but fades with light. Chloroform trauma, Mason confirmed. She'll recover fully but remain unconscious for several hours. I stay until sunbunny, Running Elk decided, settling cross-legged near the door. Watch a snake-heart man and his hunters. The simple loyalty touched Mason deeply. Running Elk offered protection without qualification or negotiation, gift, freely given in acknowledgement of healing freely provided. Thank you, Mason said, the words inadequate for the sentiment they attempted to convey. Running Elk nodded once, understanding, transcending language barriers. William watched this exchange with evident interest, another piece of his brother's life in Montana territory becoming visible. You've built connections here I didn't anticipate, William observed when Running Elk closed his eyes in meditative stillness. Different from Chicago from the war, but no less meaningful. Necessary ones, Mason corrected, though the qualification felt increasingly hollow. Survival here requires cooperation. More than survival, I think. William studied him with the directness that had always characterized their relationship before estrangement. You've found purpose again, Mason. Perhaps not the same as before, but purpose nonetheless. The observation struck uncomfortably close to realizations Mason had been avoiding. His retreat to isolation had never been complete, his abandonment of medicine never absolute. He had continued healing in different forms, different contexts, maintaining the essential core of identity while rejecting its institutional trappings. Perhaps, he acknowledged, unwilling to examine these insights fully, while immediate concerns remained unresolved. We should rest while we can. Morning will bring its own challenges. William accepted the deflection without pressing further. They settled into watchful silence as the night deepened toward dawn, each brother contemplating futures altered by unexpected reunion. Mason's thoughts turned inevitably to Eleanor, unconscious but safe in the loft above. Wells' actions had clarified options that had seemed complex hours earlier. The physician's willingness to drug and abduct Eleanor to appropriate her research through any means necessary eliminated remaining ambiguity about her returning east under his influence. She would stay in Montana territory, whether in Cedar Ridge, establishing independent practice, or continuing to San Francisco as originally planned. The choice remained hers, but the immediate threat to that choice had been neutralized. In Mason's own future, the question surfaced, unbidden, demanding consideration he had avoided during weeks of shared existence with Eleanor. His isolation had been deliberate rather than circumstantial, chosen retreat rather than imposed exile. That choice now required reassessment in light of connections formed purpose, rediscovered possibilities glimpsed through Eleanor's determined vision. Dawn arrived with pale light filtering through frost-covered windows. Running Elk remained motionless by the door, his stillness reflecting practiced vigilance rather than slumber. William dozed beside the rekindled fire exhaustion, finally overcoming caution. Mason climbed to the loft, checking Eleanor's condition with professional assessment that couldn't entirely suppress personal concern. Her breathing remained steady, color normal, pulse strong and regular. The chloroform's effects would fade soon, leaving her groggy but otherwise unharmed. He descended to prepare coffee, the familiar ritual grounding his thoughts amid circumstances that threatened to overwhelm careful emotional boundaries. By the time the rich aroma filled the cabin, William had awakened and Running Elk had shifted position to observe the clearing outside. Wells and his men prepare to leave, the Blackfoot warrior reported, saddling horses, checking weapons. I'll accompany them to the ridge, William said, accepting coffee with grateful nod. Ensure their departure continues eastward rather than circling back. Mason considered this plan balancing risks against necessities. Take my rifle. And Thunder. He knows the trails better than any mount they'll provide. The offer of his horse Mason's primary transportation and companion for 6 years represented trust he had expected never to extend again. William recognized the significance, acknowledging it with simple nod that conveyed understanding beyond words. I'll return within 2 days, he promised. We have much still to discuss, Mason, about Abigail, about the war, about everything. Yes. Mason found himself genuinely receptive to this prospect where days earlier it would have triggered immediate withdrawal. We do. Running Elk moved suddenly from his position by the window. Medicine Woman wakes, needs water. Mason grabbed a cup of water and ascended to the loft again, finding Eleanor stirring weakly confusion evident in her expression as consciousness returned. Mason, she murmured, disorientation clear in her voice. What happened? I feel strange. Wells drugged you with chloroform, Mason explained, supporting her head as she sipped water, searching for your journals while we slept. Comprehension replaced confusion, followed quickly by anger. That bastard. Did he find them? No, I woke before he succeeded. Mason helped her sit up slowly, mindful of potential dizziness from the chloroform's lingering effects. He's leaving this morning. William will accompany him to Cedar Ridge, ensure he boards the eastbound stage. Eleanor processed this information, strength visibly returning as her body cleared the drug from her system. He won't give up so easily. Not when my research represents his professional advancement. Perhaps not, but his immediate threat has been neutralized. Mason checked her pupils, satisfied by their equal response to light. Your future remains your choice, Eleanor, not his to determine. She met his gaze directly, something shifting in her expression. And what future do you envision, Mason, for yourself, for? She hesitated, uncertainty replacing her usual confidence. For us, the directness of the question demanded equal honesty in response. Mason had avoided this conversation during their weeks together, maintaining careful distance despite growing connection. Now, with external threats temporarily resolved, internal truths required acknowledgement. I've lived alone by choice, he said carefully. Built walls deliberately rather than accidentally. Isolation served its purpose after Abigail's death, after the war's moral compromises. But now, Eleanor prompted gently when he paused. Now I find those walls confining rather than protective. Mason found courage to continue to articulate what had been forming unacknowledged for weeks. Your presence has reminded me that healing requires connection, not isolation. That purpose serves life better than mere existence. Eleanor's expression softened, hope evident beneath cautious restraint. Are you suggesting partnership, Dr. Thorne professional? Or otherwise both? Mason admitted, the acknowledgement bringing unexpected relief after weeks of avoidance. If you're willing to consider Montana territory rather than San Francisco, if Cedar Ridge might provide opportunity for practice you envisioned elsewhere. I've considered it for some time, Eleanor confessed, since before Wells arrived. Since realizing that what I sought in San Francisco, independence, professional opportunity, freedom from Eastern constraints, might exist here as well, with additional considerations San Francisco couldn't offer. Well, the admission held personal implications beyond professional calculation. Mason recognized the courage required to articulate feelings developed during circumstances neither had planned or anticipated. Cedar Ridge needs a physician, he said, offering practical foundation for the personal connection both now acknowledged. Your antiseptic protocols could save lives here as surely as in any urban hospital. And he paused, searching for words adequate to emotions long suppressed. I find myself unwilling to return to solitude after these weeks of shared purpose. Eleanor reached for his hand, the simple contact conveying understanding beyond verbal expression. Then perhaps we build something new together. Not what either of us planned, but what circumstances have revealed as possibility. The suggestion held both professional and personal dimensions. Medical practice established in Cedar Ridge research, implemented in frontier conditions, relationship developed without predetermined expectations or artificial timelines. It won't be easy, Mason cautioned, honesty compelling acknowledgement of challenges ahead. Cedar Ridge will resist female physician initially. Wells may continue attempts to undermine your work from Boston. The territory itself demands adaptability few Easterners develop. Nothing worthwhile comes easily, Eleanor replied with the quiet confidence that had first drawn his admiration. Barriers exist to be overcome, not accepted as limitations. Her determination reminded Mason of qualities that had initially irritated him: stubborn optimism, refusal to accept conventional boundaries, persistence beyond reasonable expectation. Now he recognized these as essential strengths rather than naive idealism. From below came William's voice calling up to the loft. Mason Wells and his men are mounted, waiting for escort to the ridge. Coming, Mason responded reluctantly, breaking the moment with Eleanor. This conversation continues when I return. I'll hold you to that promise, Dr. Thorne, she said, smile containing both warmth and certainty, despite lingering effects of the chloroform. Mason descended to find William prepared for departure, Running Elk standing watchful by the door. The Blackfoot warrior would remain until Mason returned, ensuring Eleanor's safety during her recovery. Ready? William asked, adjusting Thunder's saddle with experienced hands. Almost. Mason retrieved a small leather case from beneath a floorboard, emergency medical supplies he always carried when leaving the cabin. Now I'm ready. They stepped outside together, brothers reunited by circumstances neither could have anticipated. Wells and his hired men waited at the clearing's edge, mounted and clearly eager to depart. I trust our agreement stands, Wells called, maintaining facade of professional courtesy despite the night's revelations. Eleanor remains free to practice where she chooses. I adapt her protocols for Eastern implementation with appropriate attribution, with the understanding that any further attempt to appropriate her research or restrict her freedom will trigger consequences you won't find professionally survivable. Mason replied, matching courtesy with underlying steel. Wells nodded stiffly, acknowledgement rather than agreement. Our business is concluded then. Good day, Dr. Thorne. Safe journey, Dr. Wells, Mason responded, the formal exchange concealing deeper hostilities neither man bothered to disguise. William mounted Thunder with practiced ease, positioning himself where he could observe all three men he would accompany to Cedar Ridge. I'll return by tomorrow evening, he promised Mason. We'll continue our conversation then. I'll be here, Mason agreed, finding comfort rather than apprehension in the prospect of addressing long-buried grievances, re-establishing connection severed 15 years earlier. The party departed, hooves crunching through snow as they followed the trail toward distant Cedar Ridge. Mason watched until they disappeared among the pines, tension easing from his shoulders only when the last rider vanished from sight. Running Elk appeared beside him, silent as always in his movements. Snake Heart Man leaves, but poison remains, he observed. Will return in different form. Perhaps, Mason acknowledged, but we'll be prepared when he does. The simple we contained multitudes, not just Mason and Eleanor, but William and Running Elk and others who had entered Mason's carefully constructed isolation, transforming it from refuge to community without his conscious intention. Good medicine grows stronger, Running Elk said with approval. Shadow Healer finds light again. The poetic assessment captured essential truth Mason had been reluctant to acknowledge. Eleanor had indeed brought light to Shadow's purpose to existence, connection to isolation. The transformation hadn't erased past grief or eliminated future challenges, but it had created space for possibilities beyond mere survival. Mason returned to the cabin where Eleanor waited, her recovery progressing as chloroform's effects diminished. They spent the day in quiet activity, practical tasks interspersed with deeper conversation about shared future neither had anticipated weeks earlier. By evening, Eleanor had regained full strength, the drug completely metabolized from her system. They sat before the fire, the familiar setting transformed by acknowledged connection between them. I've been thinking about Cedar Ridge, Eleanor said, practical planning evidently occupying her thoughts despite recent trauma. Establishing practice there will require preparation supplies from Billings, Introduction to community leaders, suitable location for office and residence. The town has grown since I last visited, Mason acknowledged. Mining operations expanding, families settling permanently rather than temporarily. They need consistent medical care beyond emergency treatment. They need both our skills, Eleanor suggested carefully. Your surgical expertise and knowledge of local conditions, my antiseptic protocols and obstetrical training. Combined practice rather than separate efforts. The proposal held professional logic that provided foundation for personal partnership, both now acknowledged. Mason considered it with the thoroughness medical decisions always received, regardless of emotional context. Combined practice would serve the community most effectively, he agreed. Though we should maintain separate residences initially, avoid unnecessary controversy while establishing professional credibility. Eleanor nodded, accepting practical necessity without offense. Propriety matters in small communities. I have no desire to create obstacles to acceptance through avoidable scandal. The mature assessment reflected Eleanor's understanding of social dynamics, her willingness to adapt strategy without abandoning essential objectives. Mason found himself continually impressed by her combination of idealism and pragmatism, principle, and flexibility. In time, he said carefully, separate residences might prove unnecessary if certain formalities were observed. The indirect reference to potential marriage hung between them neither presumptuous nor dismissive. Eleanor considered it with characteristic thoughtfulness. In time, she agreed, acknowledging possibility without pressuring timeline. When professional foundation is established, when personal connection has proven itself beyond initial attraction. The measured response reflected wisdom rather than reluctance, recognition that lasting partnership required solid foundation rather than impulsive commitment. Mason appreciated this perspective, sharing its essential caution despite growing certainty about his own feelings. Springthaw remains months away, he noted. Passes won't clear until then. We have time to develop both professional plans and personal understanding before decisions become necessary. A blessing disguised as limitation, Eleanor observed with slight smile. Forced patience serving ultimate purpose better than immediate action might have done. Mason reached for her hand, the gesture deliberate rather than impulsive. Eleanor's fingers twined with his, the simple contact conveying connection words struggled to articulate. I never expected to find purpose again after Abigail. Mason admitted honesty easier now than it had been weeks earlier. Believed that chapter of my life concluded permanently. Loss reshapes us, Eleanor said softly, but doesn't necessarily diminish capacity for future connection. Only alters its form, its expression. The insight reflected wisdom beyond her years' understanding of grief's transformation rather than elimination. Mason recognized truth in her words. His love for Abigail remained intact within him, not diminished by new feelings for Eleanor, but existing alongside them in expanded capacity rather than competition. When William returns, he said, thoughts turning to practical matters. We should journey to Cedar Ridge together. Assess opportunities, there begin preparations for spring establishment. Practical planning suits you, Eleanor teased gently. The physician emerging from the hermit's shell. Necessity rather than preference, Mason replied, though smile softened the disclaimer. Cedar Ridge represents practical opportunity rather than ideal location. Ideal locations exist only in imagination, Eleanor observed. Real places contain both possibility and limitation. The measure of wisdom lies in navigating between them. The philosophical exchange reflected growing ease between them. Conversation expanding beyond immediate concerns to deeper perspectives each had developed through different experiences. Mason found himself valuing this intellectual connection as much as the emotional bond forming alongside it. Outside darkness settled over the mountains, stars emerging in crystal clarity only wilderness provided. Inside firelight created circle of warmth that seemed to Mason both symbolic and literal illumination, returning to life long shadowed by grief and isolation. 6 months later, as spring transformed Blackfoot Valley from white desolation to vibrant renewal, Mason stood on Cedar Ridge's main street, watching progress on the building that would soon house their medical practice. Workers attached the painted sign above the entrance, Doctors Thorne and Reed, physicians and surgeons. The simple acknowledgement of Eleanor's professional status represented victory hard won during winter months. Cedar Ridge had initially resisted female physician with predictable objections, questioning her training, her physical endurance, her emotional stability for demanding profession. Eleanor had answered not with argument but demonstration. When influenza swept through mining camps in late February, she had worked alongside Mason treating dozens of patients, her antiseptic protocols preventing secondary infections that typically claimed as many lives as the initial illness. When Mrs. Jensen's difficult labor required emergency intervention, Eleanor's obstetrical expertise had saved both mother and child. Case by case, patient by patient, she had earned community's respect through competence rather than credential. Now, as their permanent practice prepared to open, Cedar Ridge had largely accepted Dr. Eleanor Reed as legitimate physician rather than Mason's assistant or nurse. William approached from the mercantile, his extended stay in Montana, having evolved from temporary visit to semi-permanent arrangement. His business acumen had proven valuable to Cedar Ridge's development, identifying investment opportunities in mining operations, negotiating supply contracts with Eastern manufacturers, establishing banking connections that brought capital to the growing settlement. "Impressive progress," he commented, nodding toward the nearly completed building. "You'll be seeing patients by month's end at this rate." "Well, sooner if Eleanor has her way, Barcer," Mason replied with affectionate certainty. "She's already organizing supplies and preparing patient record system while construction continues." William smiled, recognizing the admiration in his brother's tone. "You chose well, Mason, or perhaps was chosen well. Either way, you found partner worthy of your skills." The simple acknowledgement reflected healing between brothers that had progressed alongside construction of the medical practice. Winter months had provided opportunity for long-deferred conversations about Abigail, about wartime choices, about years of separation. Neither had truly wanted, but both had accepted as inevitable. Understanding had emerged gradually, forgiveness following in careful stages rather than dramatic moments. William had come to recognize impossible moral constraints Mason faced during war's desperate conditions. Mason had accepted William's anger as natural expression of grief rather than personal condemnation. Abigail remained connection between them. Memory honored rather than avoided, love acknowledged rather than contested. Her presence in their conversations had transformed gradually from source of pain to bond of shared affection, grief tempered by time into bittersweet remembrance both could bear. "How long will you stay?" Mason asked, question that had remained unaddressed during winter months. William considered thoughtfully. "Cedar Ridge offers opportunities Chicago doesn't. Frontier development rewards initiative in ways established cities no longer permit." He gestured toward mountains visible beyond the settlement. "Besides, I find myself appreciating this landscape more than I expected." Perhaps Abigail's appreciation for natural beauty was family trait rather than individual preference. The possibility of William's permanent relocation to Montana Territory had emerged gradually during his extended stay. Initial business interests had expanded into genuine connection with community and landscape, surprising both brothers with unexpected commonality of preference neither had previously recognized. "Eleanor would welcome your continued presence," Mason said. "It'd be, as would I." The simple admission of preference represented emotional openness that would have been impossible months earlier. Winter's enforced proximity had accelerated reconciliation that might otherwise have required years of cautious interaction. "Then perhaps I'll remain through summer at minimum," William decided. The Jensen mining operation requires continued investment oversight, and the railroad negotiations remain unresolved. Business justification provided comfortable framework for personal preference pattern. Mason recognized from their youth when William had always needed practical reason for emotional choices. Some characteristics remained consistent despite years and circumstances. Their conversation paused as Running Elk approached from the livery stable, his presence in Cedar Ridge now accepted if not entirely welcomed by all residents. The Blackfoot warrior had become regular visitor since winter months, serving as unofficial liaison between his people and the settlement that increasingly encroached upon traditional territories. "Shadow Healer," he greeted Mason with familiar designation that had expanded to include professional identity alongside personal connection. "Medicine woman sends message. Blackfoot chief's wife arrives with sick child, waits at cabin." The cabin, Mason's former isolated home, had become way station between Blackfoot territory and Cedar Ridge Place, where native patients could receive treatment without navigating settlement's sometimes hostile attitudes. Eleanor had established regular visits there, building trust with Blackfoot community while maintaining professional presence in Cedar Ridge. Serious illness, Mason asked, immediately shifting to medical assessment. Fever, spots on skin. Many children in village have same sickness. Measles, Mason diagnosed mentally. Devastating disease among native populations without inherited immunity, European descendants had developed over centuries of exposure. Tell Eleanor I'll gather supplies and join her immediately, he instructed. This requires both our attention. Running Elk nodded, understanding. We'll help Medicine Woman until Shadow Healer arrives. As the warrior departed, William studied his brother with thoughtful expression. You've found your purpose again, he observed. Not what either of us would have predicted, but purpose nonetheless. Different from Chicago, Mason acknowledged, but perhaps more necessary. These communities have limited access to medical care that Eastern cities take for granted. And Eleanor, has she found what she sought in leaving Boston? Mason considered the question seriously. Professional respect earned through demonstrated skill rather than institutional credential. Opportunity to implement her research in conditions that test its validity. Partnership that values her contribution rather than appropriating it. He smiled slightly. Yes, I believe she has. The personal dimension of that partnership remained delicate subject between brothers, acknowledged but discussed with careful respect for still healing grief both carried. William had observed developing relationship between Mason and Eleanor with evident approval, but maintained appropriate distance from its intimate details. You should join us for dinner next week, Mason suggested, bridging professional conversation to personal connection. Eleanor mentioned testing new recipes she discovered in latest medical journal from Philadelphia. William chuckled. Only Eleanor would find culinary inspiration in professional publication. But yes, I'd be delighted to join you. The simple social arrangement represented normality. Neither brother had experience for years. Family connection reclaimed from tragedy's disruption. Ordinary pleasure discovered amid extraordinary circumstance. Mason found himself valuing such moments with unexpected intensity, recognizing their preciousness after years of deliberate isolation. I should gather supplies for the Blackfoot child, he said, returning to immediate medical necessity. Measles spreads rapidly among vulnerable populations. Of course, William agreed, in understanding priority of professional obligation. I'll call on you tomorrow regarding the medical supplies shipment from Billings. The freight company promised delivery by week's end. They parted with comfortable familiarity that had developed during months of renewed connection. Mason headed toward temporary clinic they had established, while permanent building underwent construction, mentally cataloging supplies needed for treating measles outbreak among Blackfoot children. Eleanor had prepared protocols for such eventuality during winter planning sessions. Isolation procedures, supportive treatments, preventative measures for unaffected community members. Her research on infectious disease transmission had expanded from surgical applications to broader public health implementations adaptation that reflected her practical flexibility. As Mason gathered necessary medicines and equipment, he reflected on transformation. These months had brought not just to Cedar Ridge, which had gained medical practice it desperately needed, or to Blackfoot community, which had found physician willing to treat their ailments without cultural condescension, but to himself. The hermit of Wolverine Peak had emerged from isolation, reclaiming professional identity, abandoned after personal tragedy. The physician who had retreated from healing had rediscovered purpose in frontier community that valued skill above credentials. The man who had forsaken human connection had found partnership that honored past grief while creating future possibility. Mason secured supplies in saddlebags and mounted thunder setting, course for cabin that had been sanctuary and prison during years of solitude. Eleanor waited there, his colleague, his partner, his future. Between them, they would battle measles outbreak among Blackfoot children, establishing protocols that might save lives throughout territory when inevitable epidemics reached other Native communities. Not the life either had planned months earlier, not the future Mason had imagined possible after Abigail's death. But purpose, reclaimed connection, restored healing, discovered in unexpected circumstances and location. As thunder carried him toward cabin, where new chapter had begun with Eleanor's unexpected arrival during winter storm, Mason remembered Running Elk's assessment months earlier. Shadow Healer finds light again. The simple truth resonated, still gaining depth and dimension with each passing day. Eleanor had indeed brought light to shadows, purpose to isolation, future to past-bound existence. Not through dramatic revelation, but through steady presence, shared purpose, and patient persistence that matched his own determination with equal strength. The mountain path opened before him, familiar trail transformed by spring's renewal. Ahead lay challenge of measles outbreak among vulnerable children. Beyond that, completion of medical practice in Cedar Ridge. Further, still expanding service to communities throughout territory that lacked consistent care. And alongside these professional purposes, personal possibility continued. In developing relationship with Eleanor, growing naturally from shared values and complementary strengths, partnership that honored independence, while creating connection neither had anticipated finding. Mason urged Thunder to greater speed, eager to join Eleanor in work that gave meaning beyond mere existence. The call from the valley had awakened the healer, had thought permanently silenced. Now that call expanded, encompassing not just individual patients, but communities seeking health amid frontier challenges. He would answer that call not alone as he had once expected, but in partnership that multiplied capability through shared purpose. Eleanor beside him, William supporting from Cedar Ridge running elk, connecting native communities to needed care connections, forming where isolation had once seemed only possible response to life's inevitable losses. The cabin came into view as Thunder crested Final Ridge. Eleanor stood in doorway, medical bag ready, expression reflecting both concern for waiting patient and welcome for his arrival. Mason recognized in that moment truth he had resisted acknowledging during years of self-imposed exile. Healing emerged from connection rather than isolation, from engagement rather than withdrawal. Shadow healer finds light again, Running Elk had said. Not just light, Mason realized as he dismounted to join Eleanor in work. They both had trained lifetime to perform. Purpose, connection, future. The call from the valley continued, and now at last he had found voice to answer, the end.